G'day mate, 40 here. I can't remember when I last went out on New Year's Eve. For 20 plus years, sure feels like I stay home, I go to bed at the normal time. Then the bloody firecrackers tend to wake me up around midnight. But I slept in this morning until about 6:15 a.m., then got up and I've been reading and blogging and meditating ever since. So in reality, I may lead a small life, but on my own YouTube channel, I can be king. So when you live stream, you often get some painful feedback. And I remember about 7 years ago, a bloke named Glib Medley put in the chat, nobody ever raised their social status by hanging out with Luke Ford. Like, man, that stung. And it stung because it was just accurate. It was very painful reality. So here's a sick feeling that I've had countless times throughout my life. Like the cool kids are having a conversation and I go over, even though I'm not wanted, and I interject my brilliant thoughts, and then everyone ignores me and just carries on. It's just the sickest feeling. I'd like to think that in my old age, I do this less and less. But I remember I'd be in a room and Dennis Prager would walk in, and then everyone would just like gravitate towards Dennis Prager. He had this force field where the whole room would be captured and paying attention to Dennis Prager. And he says it's happened since first grade. He was always elected class president. And the currency that he was burning, so much of it was just fool's gold. But that ability to deliver pseudo-profundity, all right, it often results in a lot more social status and cachet than delivering the real thing, which is often painful and difficult to swallow. So I know about losing at life. I know about social humiliation. I know about that awful feeling when you sense that you are dropping in status. And I know that intoxicating feeling when people are glad to see you, when people laugh at your jokes, when people orient themselves towards you, when people hang on your every word. Man, is that intoxicating. But when you're losing at life and that's not happening, one of the ways that you can rescue yourself is by joining a cult, or what's another way? You can seize on some magic key. You can tell yourself, well, at least I see through the BS, right? I may be losing at life. I may not be thriving in my occupation, in my profession, in my education, in my relations with my family, my relations with my community. I may not be able to get married. I may not be able to have kids. I may not be able to develop savings or valuable social skills, but at least I see through the BS. And it's that desire to pat yourself on the back and give yourself solace that even though you're losing at life, well, at least you see through the BS. I think that accounts for people who just seize on some bizarre magic key to then explain the universe, because reality is so complicated that it's far beyond the ability of any of us to fully comprehend. And so it's tempting to seize that on that one magic key. It's like, I've got it now. I understand how the world works. And there was a long article in Compact magazine on the return of the JQ. So what the hell is the JQ, right? Normies haven't heard of the JQ, but the Jewish question was big in 19th century Europe, right? So the Jewish question referred to, can Jews become citizens like other groups? Because until about the 19th century, Jews were regarded as a separate and alien group within a nation state. And then with the rise of democracy and increasing democratic participation in the political process, eventually more and more rights were extended to Jews and to other minority groups. Now, today, 95% of people in America and Europe wouldn't even contest that Jews and other minority groups deserve to be citizens. But for the 5% who's quite skeptical of that claim, right, they will contest the Jewish question, right? Can Jews be fellow citizens just like other Americans? And politics is particularly combustible because when you're fighting for power, right, you're fighting for power over a coercive apparatus, right? That's what politics is about. It's police power, brutal power, and you really want to be on the winning side, right? Incredibly painful to be on the losing side. And so that's why fights over politics are just so intense. All right, the Free Press, Barry Weiss, she's in a top position now at CBS News. And she's doing a video here. Who will Trump fire first in 2026? Former Trump official Sarah Isgur weighs in.
Oh, hey. Hey, Sarah. Hello. You just happen to be in your apartment camera ready.
Wearing a suit jacket, no.
You look amazing. Okay, thank you so much for being here.
I'm thrilled to be here, but there's a lot to...
Wait. What's this talk about you look amazing? Is that allowed? I mean, Barry White is a lesbian. Is she allowed to tell another woman you look amazing? Just imagine if there was a male host right now and he said, Sarah, you look amazing. I don't think that'd be allowed. I mean, certainly when men say you look amazing, it means I want to fuck you. All right, men aren't usually fixated on the makeup and the hair arrangement and the clothes. So women often put a lot of effort into their public presentation. They'll often put a lot of effort in their public presentation at work. And then if they come across as sexy at work, right, men obviously are not allowed to acknowledge that, right? They are allowed to turn up the sexual heat. And you can't say anything, but if any man comments on that and says, you look amazing, right? Women understand what he really means is I want to fuck you, and he's very likely to get written up. But the harshest judgments that will be delivered to women who exude sex appeal at work is from other women who resent the comparison, who resent the competition, who resent the attention that she gets, and they will be incredibly cutting in my experience.
To break down.
Okay, so you know that this is our predictions episode, but before we get to predictions, I want the big picture because you happen to know about and talk about the subject that has maybe been the most dominant of this second administration, which is legality and the rule of law. I want you to look back at Trump's 2025 record. What is the biggest thing Trump has accomplished? What is the most troubling thing that he has accomplished?
Ooh, they're the same answer. So this is fun. The biggest thing and the most troubling thing has been the vertical control over the executive branch at a time when the presidency is so powerful because Congress isn't doing much anything. They're very good at doing Instagram reels. And Trump has really found a lot of legal and political success consolidating power, again, that vertical power within the executive branch when it comes to firing people, how to spend money, things like this, because, long time ago, Congress handed over so much of its power and then went dormant. That is a huge shift in the way the American system of...
So notice in this frame, Congress passing legislation, that's Congress doing something. That's a good thing. But the odds are at least 50% that any legislation that Congress passes will do more harm than good. It's kind of a bizarre frame on the world that, more and more legislation, that's a good thing. Also, it's not just that Congress voluntarily gave up its power, right? Elites love to obsess over procedure, right? Why is Sarah Isgur so wrapped up in process and procedure? Because it gives people like her a lot of status and power. I believe she's a Harvard-educated lawyer. And if the process and procedure is super complicated, then only people like her can comprehend and grapple with it. And it's a way of keeping the grubby masses away from the levers of power. So intellectuals and the elite love process and procedure when process and procedure works to give them more power, more status, more income, right? More influence on how the world works and keeps the grubby masses at bay. I don't think it's just a disinterested love of process. And to me, it's just self-evident that sometimes process is more important than the ends, and sometimes the ends are more important than the process. And worshipping either globally strikes me as immature.
Well, government works.
Okay.
And Sarah, when it comes to the legal stuff, since we started with that, what in your view is the biggest overreach, the biggest legal thing that keeps you up at night about the Trump administration so far? And then also I'll add to that, there is this idea that, maybe that it's too soon to say that the executive branch has grabbed all this power and the Supreme Court may rein him in. So what do you think of that in 2026?
Okay, so the thing that keeps me up at night is that it's been approximately 342 days since the TikTok ban was supposed to go into effect. And we have a president blatantly ignoring a law that was passed by Congress and signed by the previous
Okay, I call BS. Is there a good evolutionary reason why people would be kept up at night over the lack of enforcement of the TikTok ban? No, she's not kept up at night over lack of enforcement of the TikTok ban. Right? If an idea, a procedure, a program doesn't lead to evolutionary, adaptive, reproductive advantages, it's BS. So what she's doing here is engaging in a status play. She's saying, I am more keenly attuned to reality than you are, right? I am more ethical. I am just a holier and greater person than you. And so I am staying up at night worrying about the lack of enforcement of the TikTok ban, right? This is BS. This is nonsense. But this is how elites speak.
Previous president, who, by the way, also didn't enforce this ban either. That is a really bad precedent, because whatever you think of the TikTok ban, or maybe you don't think it matters at all, this idea that a president can just shrug and say, like, I don't wanna, again, is a pretty bad thing. My hope is that, yes, the president has consolidated that vertical power in the executive branch, the hiring and firing. Everyone reports to him, whether you're at the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice. I'm actually great with that and think separation of powers is a good thing. But the Supreme Court also needs to...
So Congress didn't just give up all its power, right? People want results. And in an incredibly complicated world, often the only way to get people results is for the executive branch to act, right? It's in the adjustment to reality that we've seen more and more power given to the executive branch, because often it's the only part of government that can get things done. The Supreme Court frequently deliberates for months and for years before it issues a ruling. For example, Trump's tariffs. The Supreme Court's supposed to come out with a ruling this month, but that's no way to run a country, right? This should have been decided months ago. And so the executive branch has so much power because it's frequently the only one that can get things done.
Then make the presidency less powerful and say that Congress has to speak clearly when it's giving presidents power. It can't just say, do clean air, and then allow the president to fill in all those gaps, including not just regulations, but enforcement, punishments, fines. We now have judge, jury, and executioner all in the executive branch. James Madison wrote this was the definition of tyranny, to have the judicial power, executive power, and legislative power all in one branch. The Supreme Court this year, if we were to call this term anything, it is the term of the structural constitution. What does it mean to have three separate branches of government?
Sarah,
So I'm a loyal New York Times reader, and the other day I came across the perfect op-ed that kind of exemplifies the zeitgeist here, right? Here's the headline. The idea that once held America together died in 2025. Right? The idea that an idea held America together is absurd. America has always been a nation composed of people, and it has primarily been held together by what the people have in common with each other, not just circumstances, but also history and language and inclinations. So the idea that an idea held America together or held any nation together is absolutely absurd. I love ideas, right? I am an intellectual slut. I am an intellectual gigolo. I fall in love with beautiful new ideas every day, seemingly, and ultimately stay loyal to almost none. But you're waiting with bated breath, right? What's this idea that once held America together? So the author, John Fabian Witt, he's got a new book, The Radical Fund, How a Band of Visionaries and $1 Million Upended America. I have no idea what that book's about, but here's his New York Times op-ed. In a year when the United States seemed more split than ever, Americans united in one way. We demanded results and we wanted them now. Well, guess what? Americans did not unite over politics. 95% of Americans don't pay that much attention to politics. Right? It's a tiny sliver of Americans who are obsessed with politics. But we demanded results, and we wanted them now. From ICE raids designed as a theater of terror. Well, I just saw a statistic, and people are saying 2 million people have left the United States since Trump came in for his second term due to ICE raids and the like. All right, they have had a substantial effect on the United States. So this notion that ICE raids are just some kind of theatrical performance, there is an element of theatrical performance, but it has had a profound change in the reality of this country. Okay, GLP-1 shortcuts for weight loss. Well, if the drugs work, they seem to work. AI-generated term papers, if that works, it works. Rampaging Doge bros. Well, Doge put, over 10,000 federal bureaucrats out of jobs. Summary Alien Enemies Act deportations, that worked. Americans raged against the journey and clamored for the destination, no matter what the lawyers and the chatbot therapists said. Yeah, people tend to be more interested in results than in process. Now, elites and experts pictured themselves as those rare, brave, few, hardy souls, this band of brothers who prioritize process over results. Why? It's not because they are disinterestedly venerating a process. It's because it works to their advantage. They like the process that sustains and elevates their own status, power, and income. If the process worked against that, they wouldn't be all down with process. But here's another elite telling us outcomes seem to be all that matters to the common people. Winners win, losers follow rules and talk it over. The 2025 revolt against process signaled the final collapse of a powerful idea that once promised to hold the country together. I mean, what kind of delusional fool thinks that the idea of process could ever hold a country like the United States or any country together? I mean, this is a delusion. Only an intellectual could believe something so stupid. At the height of America's 20th century power, belief in process served as a guiding concept among the legal and political elites of both parties who sought to manage our most difficult national disagreements. That is true. Belief in process was a guiding concept among the legal and political elites of both parties, not just because it was disinterestedly, objectively better, but because it served their interests. It enhanced their power, status, and prestige and income. Right? As soon as process works against that, they're no longer so enamored with process. Process became the centerpiece of America's powerful commitment to democracy during the struggle with totalitarian regimes in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. Well, if you're going to get anything done of a large nature, you have to use bureaucracy. That's just how it is. Generation of social scientists, lawyers, and statesmen came to see the genius of American government, not as any one set of values, but rather as a collection of institutions, methods, and techniques by which the United States articulated its principles and resolved its controversy. This is foolish. The New Deal ushered in all sorts of unilateral actions by the president who intimidated the Supreme Court and other American institutions frequently to get his way. The idea that the United States is primarily guided by a set of principles is absurd. That's not how the world works. Values might change. Elections might change. Process offered a deeper continuity. Yeah, process offers a deeper continuity if it serves the interest with people who have their hand at the till of the process. Right? Sometimes process is more important than results. Sometimes results are more important than process. Right? Elites love process when it serves their interests, when it gives them power, status, and income. Right? Elites see in process, it's a mechanism, right, to maintain stability, legitimacy, and continuity in a diverse and divided nation without requiring agreement on ultimate truths. Wrong. They agree on the ultimate truth. They want to preserve their own power, status, and income. Right? Yeah, it was a powerful idea. Yes, it was a civil religion of the establishment. Did it hold the country together? I don't know about that. It certainly held the establishment together because it was in their interest. So if process led to elites losing their jobs, do you think they'd love process? If it saw elites losing their fortunes, do you think they'd love process? If it led to reduced status for elites, do you think they would love process? Right? Elites torch process and rules all the time when the process and rules are not in their interests, right? It's a fair weather movement, right? Elites love the rules of the game as long as they keep winning the game. What happens when the process accidentally produces a populist or anti-elite result? After Brexit, after a Trump election, did the elites say, well, the process spoke, we must respect it? No, they immediately attacked the legitimacy of the voters. They were dominated by misinformation, Russian interference. They had low information. They then used lawfare, bureaucratic stalling, emergency measures to overturn and delay the result, right? Their loyalty was never to the process. It was not to voting. It was not to democracy. It was to outcome, to their continued rule. Come on, get real.
One of the, I think, big question marks around the legal stuff to do with Trump is to what extent is this the latest development in a kind of ever eroding set of legal norms and presidents ignoring the rule of law? Biden did it with college tuition, for example.
Obama arguably did it with Dreamers.
Right. So to what extent is it that, or is it Trump is an unprecedented assault on a republic of laws that we have never seen before, and this is a clean break from last year?
Nope. Trump is the symptom. He is not really the cause of this. As you guys just said, this particular moment is traced back to Obama's pen and phone, right? If Congress won't do what I want in immigration, I have a pen and a phone to rally the American people to my cause. And he had his year of executive action. We have been in a government by executive order ever since then. And as you said, Joe Biden took it to even greater heights, Donald Trump taking it to even greater heights. So it is an escalation, certainly. But Trump's not the one who came up with this. And frankly, Trump didn't cause Congress to roll over and die.
So Trump is a symptom. He's also a cause.
Either.
Okay. Sarah, I don't know if you're feeling this way, but I feel a little bit like, and maybe this is the case for all presidents in the second part of their second administration, but it feels like things are fizzling out a little bit for Trump. Like, you look at the speech that he gave that interrupted CBS's 3-hour Survivor the other night. I will say CBS television watchers were not happy to sort of like trumpet his accomplishments on the economy. Then you have this Vanity Fair spread that I could not get enough of. I'm sure you guys have seen it and seen the up close pictures. I don't know. There's like a vibe in the air.
So regular people, are they obsessed with the Vanity Fair spread of the White House? All right. What type of person is obsessed with this Vanity Fair photo spread? Press 1 if you are obsessed with the Vanity Fair process, Vanity Fair photo spread.
That things are sort of sputtering out. Am I wrong to see that? Is that just what my algorithm is feeding me?
No, ever since those off-cycle elections that we had in early November, it has felt already that Donald Trump is maybe not fully, but on the cusp of being a lame duck president. Republicans suddenly pushing back. I mean, this is small. But
so when the process is complicated, right, that is a barrier to entry, right? Who can afford to navigate a 2,000-page regulatory filing, right? Only some kind of massive NGO or massive corporation with a team of Harvard-trained lawyers, right? When process effectively bans competition, when process effectively elbows out regular people from the room, when process filters out anyone who lacks the cultural capital and the elite education and the financial capital to participate, right? When process serves the interests of elites, they love process, right? If process became simple, fast, and accessible to everyone, right? If we had direct digital voting on laws, elites would hate it. They'd call it mob rule, dangerous instability, right? Elites love the complexity of the process because complexity is a moat that protects their castle. And the proof? Think about how quickly elites invoke emergencies to bypass process when their safety is at risk. Remember COVID? Oh, we had an emergency. We got to bypass process. 2008 financial crisis, right? Banks seem to be failing. Do they follow the process? No, they suspend the process, right? They print money. They bail out banks overnight, right? Process was for the small people when their homes were foreclosed on. Emergency rescue was for the elites. So process is a discipline that the elites impose on you to keep you slow and managed. It's not a discipline that they impose on themselves when they need a bailout or they want a war. Right? Elites love process the way a casino loves the rules of blackjack because they know the math is rigged in the house's favor. Right? If the regular people started winning every hand, right, the house wouldn't say, we respect the process. They would change the rules or they would close the table. Right? Process is superior when the cost of a false positive, making a mistake, is higher than the cost of inaction. Right? At other times, the results are more important than the process. Right? During COVID, right, did they just embrace the process? No, they bypassed standard scientific debate and forced a consensus result. Right? Sometimes results are superior when the cost of inaction is higher than the cost of a mistake. Right? If you have a fire that's threatening to burn out the Palisades, the cost of waiting for a pre-deployment form is 12 dead people. Right? You need the result. You need the water on the fire immediately. If a virus is spreading exponentially, a perfect plan next month is useless. You need an imperfect lockdown today like Australia did. Right? General Patton didn't win battles by filling out forms. He won by breaking things to get the objective. Right? The Los Angeles Fire Department treated a fire in the Pacific Palisades on January 1, right, as a paperwork problem. And as a result, it burned out of control, right? The elites love process because it's like a courtroom, and the results are for their kind, right? They get to decide on drone strikes, and they get to ignore the law when that is useful to get the bad guys, right? Sarah Isgur and company, they love process when it preserves their power, their status, and their income, right? Process is not just a philosophy. It is a protection racket for the credentialed class, for people like Sarah Isgur, who went to Harvard Law School, right? Sarah Isgur, David French, this entire legal pundit complex are like a medieval guild. They love the process for the same reason a cobbler loves a law that says only licensed cobblers can fix shoes, right? It guarantees them a monopoly on the trade. If politics is about results, like build the wall or forgive the loans, right? A king or a president could just do it. They don't need Sarah Isgur to explain it to them. So efficiency is the enemy of the lawyer. When the government becomes efficient, gets things done, legal billing hours dry up. So what's the solution? You create a process so complex that no one can navigate it, right, without a law degree. So you have an elite class of lawyers, consultants, compliance officers that set up a toll booth on every road. You want to build a bridge, you have to pay the toll. Environmental review. You want to fire an employee, you have to pay the toll. They want to monetize friction. Every new page of regulations, a new billable hour for the class of people who know how to read it. They aren't protecting the country. They are protecting their own interests, their own market share. Right? Process is the primary weapon they use to enforce status closure. Right? Anyone can have a result, good idea, but only a select few have the credentials to understand the arcane procedure required to implement it. So when you insist the procedure is the only source of legitimacy, elites disqualify the unwashed masses from participation.
But the Epstein files stuff, or the Rob Reiner tweet where Donald Trump sort of mocks Rob Reiner's murder. You saw Republicans pushing back really hard, as in they're no longer.
Rob Reiner did everything he could, was obsessed with fighting Donald Trump for 10 years, and Donald Trump reacted in an honest way. It was uncouth, but it was honest.
Afraid of him because it's clear that if Trump isn't on the ballot, he doesn't have a lot of power anymore. And without juice, that lame duck thing creeps in real fast, like the tide is moving in.
So what do you predict, Sarah, will be Trump's biggest domestic move in 2026?
So how do I feel about the Anti-Defamation League going after Tommy Robinson, yet saying nothing about UK's grooming gangs? Well, the Anti-Defamation League and other NGOs like it are left-wing advocacy groups. I am on the right. I don't like the ADL, right? I can't stand the ADL. Look, if you're a traditional Jew, you know that there's no mitzvah, there's no divine command to fight anti-Semitism. If you have a fulfilling way of life, you don't get obsessed with these useless fights against anti-Semitism and the like, right? Different groups have different interests. When you have an intense clash of interests between groups, right, you get what's called bigotry and all sorts of impolite emotions. But what drives antagonism between groups is conflict of interests. It's not lack of education.
Or do you think, and this is, I think, something that surprised many of us. We were talking to Neil Ferguson as part of this episode. Like, a lot of the past Trump year has been about foreign policy and deals abroad, whether or not you think those deals are good. What do you think is going to be his domestic focus in 2026, if anything?
I've been looking forward to you asking me this question for weeks, months.
Wow, Sarah. Exciting life you got going on there.
This is it. I just wait for Barry to call. I don't exist until she calls, actually. I'm sort of like that GPT of legal predictions. My prediction for the Trump administration, and look, my window's probably a little bit bigger than just 2026, is that it will be one of the most inconsequential, ineffective presidencies in American history.
Yeah, right. The second Trump presidency, most inconsequential presidencies in American history, because he didn't pass enough legislation. If you only pass laws, that's the only thing that truly matters. Well, there are other things that matter aside from laws. So my father was a theologian. My father got 2 PhDs. He was very educated in theology. And so for my father, theology was the most important thing in the world. From about 8th grade until I was about 19, For me, journalism was the most important thing in the world. And then I decided I wanted to become an economist. So from age 19 to about 22, economics as an academic discipline, that was the most important thing in the world. Then I fell in love with Judaism as the embodiment of ethical monotheism, and ethical monotheism became the most important thing in the world to me for about 10 years. Then I found I could make a living and appear on TV and develop a large following by blogging about the porn industry, and so revealing dark truths about this uncomfortable topic. That became the most important thing in the world. I was a brave truth teller. Right? Why do I primarily talk about uncomfortable topics? Why do I focus on those things that happen out where the buses don't run no more? Because I can't compete against the really smart, gifted people on conventional safe topics, right? I have to go to the uncomfortable, unsafe topics to be able to make a contribution. So I got into it, the Alexander technique, and for a while that was the most important thing in the world. So for lawyers, like, law is the most important thing. I would assume for dentists, dentistry is the most important thing. For accountants, accounting is the most important thing. All right, we all tend to view the world through our own self-interest. Sarah Isgur, I believe, Harvard-trained lawyer, right? She sees passing legislation. That's the most important thing in the world. If you don't do this, then you don't matter. I grew up in Australia. The general attitude was if you weren't Australian, you didn't matter.
Because he's doing it all without Congress through executive orders that can be wiped away on day one of his successor's presidency. And he's choosing not to work with Congress. And so whether you love Trump, hate Trump, like what he's done, hate those executive orders, it's a stupid, stupid way to govern when your party controls both houses, because there is no legacy here. There is nothing that's going to outlast, January 20th, 2028.
Sarah, one thing that's quite different this time is we haven't really seen many firings of senior Trump admin people and cabinet people. So, Pete Hegseth, Kash Patel, RFK Jr., they get a lot of publicity. Not all of it is positive. Some of that's their fault, not the media's fault.
But there was definitely a point at different times where it was like, Pete Hegseth, surely he only has a few days left. Kash Patel, surely he'll be out by next week, but they're all still there.
So my question to you, and this is, like I said, a predictions podcast. So will we have a kind of like Night of the Long Knives in 2026 in which Trump axes all his allies and brings in a whole new team? Who's on the hot seat? Who's going to go? Who's going to stay?
It is remarkable how little firing this second Trump administration has done. But isn't that just like a classic political insider question, right? Who will Trump fire first? Okay, Andrew Gold is a Jewish dissident on the right in England. And he's got a video entitled, I Confront a Racist. Boy, this is exciting. Guys, here we got a Jewish dissident streamer on YouTube confronting a racist. There's so much more spicy conversation going on YouTube these days. I felt strangled, right? YouTube regulation, social media censorship, it took away the best years of my life. From 2019 to 2022, I just felt dominated and strangled and repressed by all the censorship on social media. Then Elon Musk buys X, and things turn around for the better.
Are you a racist?
If that makes me racist, so be it. I wear it proudly. I've had enough. I want everyone gone.
So someone's going to come knock on my door.
It's not personal. It's necessary.
That will not work.
To find out who would have to be removed.
So guess what? Different groups have different interests. It's entirely possible that his experience of life and his understanding of his group would be enhanced by these awful racist policies and procedures. And then different groups and people with a different experience of life are going to react with horror. Why? Because different groups have different hero systems, different senses of what's heroic and what's right and what's wrong.
The easiest way to do this is medical records.
This is mental.
I don't believe you're European. I think you're Jewish.
But I'm not going to Israel.
Yeah, if I had power, mate, you would be.
Yeah. All right, do you think this guy has the organizational ability to get things done?
You shake your leg and get aggressive when we talk about Jews being European. I'm not shaking my leg and just giving you...
I just have a twitch.
The twitch only comes up when Jews are mentioned. We can move on to another topic.
Oh, so if you can point out that the other person is triggered, right, that's supposed to be some big win because he's shaking his leg when he talks about Jews. Right? I think that's a pretty weak argument.
Topic if you want to.
I can envision millions of people being thrown onto planes and deported from my country.
I think Tommy Robinson will fight against that.
Tommy Robinson will do because he's a traitor.
Well, guess what? You're just like this racist in that you too engage in niche construction. Every single form of life engages in niche construction. Every single form of life tries to change the niche around it to make it more suited for its own thriving, for its own group's thriving. So you may not like the niche construction of this bloke, and you may not like the niche construction of that bloke, but we're all doing it, all right? It's not just something that perfidious elites do, right? Taking advantage of crises to change the rules, right? Everybody is opportunistic. Everybody is constantly trying to change the niche around them, to bully their opponents, and to give strength and succor to people like them, to seize the coercive apparatus of political power, to then change the niche, change the nation, change the laws, change the rules, change the institutions to fit their own interests.
Tommy Robinson has loads of foreign friends. He promotes multiculturalism. He's a Zionist piece of shit.
Do you have any room in your mind for that you might be wrong?
No.
See, that's the sign of an ideologue.
An ideologue.
Can you do me a favour? If you get value from these conversations,
No.
hit subscribe.
And I want to protect their future. So if that makes me racist, so be it. I wear it proudly.
In that sense, you're probably the...
So most of the conversations that I have with Gemini, most of the conversations that I listen to on YouTube would have been banned between 2019 and 2022. Right? Let us rejoice in the return of all the free speech that I want is now available on YouTube.
the most prominent racist in the country, the biggest racist in the UK.
Well, nationalist is the term I would use. I wouldn't introduce myself as racist. But yes, I would argue that probably one...
So to call someone a racist means that your new hero system that has no historical precedent is some kind of objective universal reality. There was no such sin of racism effectively prior to the 1920s, effectively prior to the 1960s. Right? Nobody talked about racism really until about the 1960s. So Jesus didn't talk about the sin of racism. The Prophet Muhammad didn't talk about the sin of racism. Maimonides and Nachmanides didn't, and Rashi, right? None of the great rabbis of the medieval period talked about the sin of racism. The Bible doesn't talk about the sin of racism. The Quran doesn't talk about the sin of racism. There is no historical precedent for any such construction as a sin of racism until effectively the 1960s. And then you get a brand new moral idea that has no historical precedent. But yeah, sure, this is the objective global reality.
One of the largest nationalist accounts in the UK, not civic nationalist, but real nationalist.
Okay, so that's something that we'll have to explain, because a lot of the audience will know what all of that means, but a lot won't be in with the ins and outs. There's kind of a civil war almost on the right. I don't even know if it's a civil war going on between what is it? You can explain civil.
So we're under no obligation to take anyone at face value, whether it's me or you, Andrew Gold, or the guest here. So someone can call themselves a big racial nationalist, and they might actually be more of a cultural, religious, civic nationalist, but for whatever reason, they find incentives to proclaim themselves a racial nationalist. Other people might really be racial nationalists, but they recognize social incentives, so instead they frame things in religious, cultural, and civic terms.
Civil nationalism and ethno-nationalism, what are these terms?
So ethno-nationalism is nationalism. There is only one form of nationalism, civic nationalism.
All right, that's nonsense. So even racial nationalism and ethno-nationalism has a cultural and a religious and a civic component. Right? The world's a complicated place. Every single developed country has significant elements of capitalism. It has significant elements of socialism and of oligarchy and aristocracy and bureaucracy and libertarianism. All right, all regimes in developed countries have many different things going on, and all nationalism contains civic components, religious components, cultural components, racial components, ethnic components.
Nationalism is some absurd mixed direction that's been taken away. It's realistically, civic nationalists are liberals that do not like Islam. And that's pretty much their position. A lot of civic nationalists think that anyone can be British. They think.
So the concept of civic nationalism is that you value civic virtues more than anything else. It's not the way the world works. all right, we tend to devote ourselves to people like ourselves. We tend to sacrifice ourselves for people like ourselves. We tend to be most comfortable with people who are like ourselves. And what makes people like us? Well, it often has a racial component, an ethnic component, a cultural component, a language component, a religious component, a civic component, a deportment component, an occupational component, an educational component, a geographic component. Right, we're complicated creatures, and we form alliances, and we form bonds with people on all of those categories and more. Right? Very few people go through life where it's just occupation, or it's just civic virtue, or it's just race, or it's just religion, or it's just culture.
Think that you come over, you're born here, you're British, that's their position, and they think that's okay. Whereas a nationalist, my position is that England belongs to the English, this is our land, and we should protect our future. Our people are on the verge of becoming a demographic minority in our own homeland. That's unacceptable. And my line...
So imagine this bloke's in a dark alley, and he's surrounded by people who want to kill him. But 3 black lesbians come to his aid, right? Do you think he would reject their succor if he depends on them for help? So you can proclaim everything about racial supremacy, religious supremacy, civic supremacy, ethno-supremacy, but when push comes to shove, you're going to react according to the dictates of the particular situation you're in. So to gain coercive power of the government, you need to form alliances with people of different groups. All right, you're going to do that. And reality does not usually allow you just to be pure, because the world's a complicated place, constantly changing. As the situation changes, incentives change, and where you once looked at things through a racial lens, suddenly you look at things through a cultural lens or just a pure power lens, right? If you're fighting for your survival, you need everything possible to protect you, and that might include making alliances with different racial and religious groups.
And it's total remigration.
So civic, I suppose, is about the country. That's what it means. It's like it's a nationalism that just is and of itself. It's just nationalism. And then you're saying it's just nationalism, but then those who are like me would say yours is ethno-nationalism because it is dependent on one's ethnicity.
But that is nationalism. It's based on a nation state which is built upon ethnicities. So on that stage, yes, basically to simplify, the civic nationalist approach is about values, whereas ours is about ethnicity and people.
But people are all about ethnicity and people. All right, they also are profoundly shaped and profoundly revere values and culture and religion and various civic virtues. And people who revere civic virtues and culture and religion, they are also consciously and unconsciously shaped by their racial and ethnic loyalties as well. So for the contemporary proponents of the Jewish question, right, they see Jews as behind every left-wing cause and degenerate social trend since Karl Marx launched his assault on Western civilization. So quite a thoughtful essay here in Compact Magazine about the return of the JQ. And so people like this will tell you, Jews bankrolled the civil rights movement and that destroyed the Constitution. They championed open borders. They championed a demographic transformation of the country. They championed soft on crime policies that ruined countless American cities. And they devised and they promoted communism and psychoanalysis and sexual liberation and feminism and critical theory and multiculturalism and all these corrosive ideologies that rotted the American mind, destroyed the fabric of society. And Jewish control of the media in Hollywood, that allows them to deceive honest, poor Gentiles. Right, and so this is the dominant Jewish question critique by distance. At the same time, the primary opponents of all these policies are often Jews as well.
Our blood and our people.
What is an ethnicity exactly? It's not quite a race or a culture, is it?
No, it's sort of in between. So an ethnic group are a distinct group of people that have been formed over a various amount of time. So the English are a distinct ethnic group, the Scottish are a distinct ethnic group, the Welsh are a distinct ethnic group, and so forth. And these people are the owners of this land. We've created this land. Our people have built this country. They've put blood and soil into this. And the future of our people is England. And without England, without the English, there is no England. So ultimately, the ethnic groups have the ultimate hierarchy on the country. So England, the English are white people, but we are English by ethnicity. So not all white people are English, but all English people are white.
Not all white people are English.
So in World War II, the United States had many of the top physicists in the world because the United States didn't kick out its Jews like Germany. And so with a disproportionately Jewish group of physicists, the United States developed the most powerful weapon the world has ever seen, the nuclear bomb, which it was able to drop on Japan and possibly save 1 million, 2 million American Gentile lives. So if you really need the particular contributions of a tiny group of people, even if they are from an outgroup, it would be irrational and against the promptings of your desire to survive and thrive. Say, oh no, I'm not going to accept help from this outgroup. Right? In some, the situation's the boss. So in some situations, most powerful person in the world is the secretary or the mechanic or the janitor. Other times it's the coder, or sometimes it's middle management, or it might be HR, or it might be the lawyer or the accountant or the doctor. Right? Different situations require different skills and different coalitions.
English, but all English people are white. Okay, I see what you're saying. Of English ethnicity, then, how do we boil that down? What do you do with kind of Saxons, Anglo-Saxons, Celts, all of those kinds of things?
So this is an argument that leftists would always...
So I converted to Judaism, to the best of my knowledge, at 0 Jewish ancestors. So I am probably quite genetically distinct from most of the people I spend most of my spare time around. And yet I feel particularly comfortable and at ease in Jewish life because it values things that I am naturally inclined towards, learning and verbal dexterity and reading books and study and education and an intense journey in life, a strong in-group identity where people sacrifice and help each other. Right? It seems to resonate with me. And to the best of my knowledge, I have 0 Jewish ancestry. And yet I feel most at ease among Jews. Now, I go back to Australia and I just immediately relax. I feel at ease in Australia. So depending on the situation, depending on the circumstances, depending on what's going on with me, right, I will feel more or less at ease with one group or another.
And civic nationalists would always present to you and they'll say, well, what about this small admixture of, let's have a look at the world map. This is the world map. This tiny little circle in the middle is where our people were formed from the Germanic sphere. And we built this land over 1,000 years. Nobody would say that the Maori are not indigenous to New Zealand, but everyone would say that the English are not indigenous to England, even though we've been in this land longer.
Well, everyone came from somewhere, right? Nobody emerged out of the ground, right? Every religion depended on the particular circumstances that gave rise to the development of that religion, right? Every people moved from one area to another, and a country, a nation state, it belongs to those who have the power to seize control and to protect themselves.
I would say the English are indigenous to England.
But overall, from a leftist argument, that's what they would say.
The left would say that.
Yeah.
So I think that's where civic nationalists like me would have some sympathy with. It's not just about Islam. You know, I think there's some sympathy with this idea of like, hey, come on.
Okay, so Andrew Gold bills himself as a civic nationalist, but guess what? Most American Jews prefer to live around white people. If they marry someone who's not Jewish, it's overwhelmingly someone who's white. So even the civic nationalist, right, often have strong racial preferences that they would never say out loud. Right? Why do American Jews overwhelmingly prefer to live in white areas? When they marry out of the tribe, why is it overwhelmingly they marry white people? Why aren't they marrying Latinos and black people and Asians in equal numbers? Why do Jews overwhelmingly choose to live in white areas rather than black or brown or Asian areas?
There's no magic soil. The people who built this incredible culture, which we've got here, the best culture in the world that we've built, were built by a bunch of people of similar ethnicities, right? But it is true that they are multiple ethnicities, right? English, we are talking about several things. And with Scottish, it's like the Scots and the Celts and the Vikings and stuff.
We are a distinct ethnic group that's been built up over time. So over 1,000 years, these distinct...
So every conspiracy and every unpopular critique of the way things are done often has some basis in fact, right? Jews are disproportionately successful in certain areas. There is a powerful lobby for Israel. It does have powerful allies in Washington. It was supporting the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It's hard not to wince when you hear Nikki Haley or Lindsey Graham conflate America and Israel. Right? The United States and Israel are separate countries that sometimes have things in common and other times have different interests. Right? Ashkenazi Jews are vastly overrepresented in left-wing movements. Jews of Eastern European heritage, where Jews lived for centuries in a state of loathing and mutual loathing with the non-Jews, right, tend to be much more radical than Jews of Western European heritage, where Jews by and large respected the non-Jews around them. So it's uncomfortable, right? But you can recognize the appeal and some of the facts behind the JQ analysis, right? And what do you have with the JQ analysis? You've got a clear, distinct, sharp answer to the question of who bears the blame for our present problems, right? You could wrestle with the mind-boggling complexity of the managerial neoliberal world order and all its diffuse centers of power and conflicting factions. But if there's just a central nexus of control, if it's just global Jewry, right, then it makes everything simpler, right? It's all you need to know. And it's edgy. It's transgressive. You get to mock all the other contemporary pieties, right? The right tends to mock various pieties about race, sex, and sexuality. But then the conventional right, of course, will be silent on the JQ. So if you take up the JQ, you get to mock all of our dominant pieties. And you get to absolve America, right? If America is such a mess today, it's not America's fault. It's the Jews' fault, right? It's a version of Ibram X. Kendi's central moral teaching, right? There's nothing wrong with Gentiles. America may be corrupted, but Gentiles have nothing to do with it. The Gentiles are just too naive. So it's a payoff. It meets vital emotional needs.
Groups that have formed together to create the ethnogenesis of the English, that's who we are as a people. To deny that and say we're various ethnic groups is ridiculous. Of course, we're distinct from the Scottish, or we're distinct from the Welsh and the Irish and so forth, but we're also very similar because we have a lot of shared history. But to say that we're not a distinct ethnic group is completely denying who the English are, and that's unacceptable.
But it's a distinct ethnic group made up of several ethnicities.
Yes, and that's how ethnic groups are formed over time.
And they came together and did well. So it's not inconceivable. There are problems at the moment, but it's not inconceivable.
So if this guy was a multimillionaire, if he was thriving in life, if he had a job with high status, if he was running a corporation, if he was a tenured faculty member, if life was going swimmingly for him, he wouldn't be saying these things. But if you're failing at life, right, you need to find some comfort, and one form of comfort is to embrace religion. Another form of comfort is to embrace the idea that you see through the BS. Yeah, I'm losing at life, I'm failing here and there, but at least I see through the BS. So what can we offer people, right, who need a pro-social way to feel like they matter, right? What are the specific psychological and social functions for those people who embrace the JQ, particularly young men on the right, right? Why are so many just monomaniacally obsessed with Jews? Well, you have to understand the payoff, right? You get to take the mind-boggling complexity of reality and just boil it down and say, hey, our problems are the fault of one group. So you could say, hey, study managerialism as described by James Burnham, or the iron laws of oligarchy, or study elite rule, right? Democracy tends to drift left. America and the developed world has tended to become more and more feminine, more and more moving towards equality. So what are the pathologies? If you see those as pathologies, then what are the pathologies inherent to the structures of liberal democracies? Right? People want to feel that they have secret knowledge, right? That they are better than everyone else. So the JQ functions as gnosis, right? A secret insight that allows the person to feel more intelligent, more brave than everyone else, and just pierce through the illusions of ordinary politics, right? You're smarter than the established intellectuals. So perhaps we could encourage the mastery of difficult but tangible subjects like logistics or engineering or classical languages, classical history, or economics, right? You can acknowledge uncomfortable patterns in reality without descending into bogus conspiracy theories, right? If you notice patterns, and they are patterns that you shouldn't say out loud if you want to have high social status, that seems to be a worthy topic of inquiry that you engage in quietly, right? You can recognize that the West and Americans are squandering their inheritance, but instead of embracing victimhood and the mental habits of being a servant, perhaps embrace agency. If the West is dying, it's because the West has made some bad decisions. Maybe you need to actively participate in some kind of revitalization, maybe a neighborhood watch, maybe develop a family, maybe influence your local government, help to build your community rather than just venting and complaining online, Right? The most natural thing in the world, if you're a young man, is to rebel against the status quo and to mock contemporary pieties. Right? What are some conventional pieties that deserve mocking? Right? In a culture of licentiousness, right? Maybe living a disciplined or religious or traditional or masculine life, maybe that is inherently transgressive. Right? Maybe challenging the identitarian trinity of race, sex, and class critical theory, right, through well-reasoned argument rather than just bogus conspiracy thinking, right? You can acknowledge that different groups are overrepresented in this and that, right? You can embrace patterns, right? You can embrace worldview that grants people agency and dignity, developing dignity based on competence, not on bogus forms of secret knowledge, and clarity, right? Recognizing the sophisticated, diverse forces that shape our lives, and do it with a strongly committed in-group, right? So right now, victimhood confers a powerful form of moral status, right? If you see your group as victimized, you can then justify anything. When Donald Trump said the 2020 election was rigged, those who believed him, right, they were just morally off the hook. There was no response that then becomes immoral if an election is stolen from you. Now, I know what you're saying. 40, I need more Sarah Isgur.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little like when you go to college and we call it the turkey drop, where everyone breaks up after the, Thanksgiving break, basically. Like, I'm waiting for the turkey drop. I think Attorney General Pam Bondi, my understanding is, really no longer has the ear of the president on most things. That Ed Martin, for instance, is a far more powerful figure within the Department of Justice. And so you should look probably for her not to be Attorney General for that long. But there's an interesting legal thing weaved in here, which is if he fires someone, who can he...
So Sarah Isgur looks amazing. She's a woman in her 40s. She's married. She's got children. She put a lot of effort into her appearance, and she always looks amazing that I see. So I know it's socially gauche to comment on it, but why is it okay for Barry Weiss to say, you look amazing? Because it's lateral bonding, right? I'm validating your effort. I'm boosting your confidence before we perform, right? It's mutual aid. And female socialization override kicks in, right? Women complimenting women, that's all about solidarity. It's not predatory. Now, if a straight male host says it, then you have a hierarchical assessment. You've got the problematic male gaze, right? The man is saying, I am evaluating your physical value. God forbid, I have a friend who, before I share with him the thought of this or that female intellectual, he asked me, God forbid, certain questions about her physical appearance so that he can evaluate her worth. So if a man says, you look amazing, he is focusing on her appearance. He's dragging it back down to a decorative object, right? It seems like a status violation, right? So perhaps if the host is male and gay, right, he's got total immunity, right? Because the sexual threat is removed from the equation. Or if old friends, or if it's taking place at a black tie event, the rules are suspended because the entire point of the event is appearance. So several months I went to a lot of red carpets, and people look amazing, and I was taking photos at various Hollywood red carpets. But the thing that bugged me about that is couldn't have any substantial conversation, right? There was just something about the red carpet that made conversations quite low IQ. So if a man says anything about how she looks, right, he doesn't just get canceled, he gets labeled cringe, right? He comes across not just as a predator, he seems unprofessional and socially clumsy. He breaks the fourth wall of intellectual debate. He shows himself as distracted, that he's not taking the topic seriously. But Barry Weiss, she gets a pass because she's one of the girls. Right? The normal man looking at Sarah Isgur in this video thinks, I want you. And women can dress up, they can look sexy, they can crank up the sexual heat. But if a man makes any kind of acknowledgement, right, he's in trouble. So modern civility demands that we pretend that the rules of biology and evolution are just simply suspended, right? And women like Sarah Isgur get to maximize their leverage by maintaining some kind of plausible deniability, right? She can wear an outfit and put on makeup that accentuates her sex appeal, but if any man, straight man, remarks on her, then he is cringe. So men tend to be literalists in this domain. And it's funny that women tend to be the harshest critics of women dressing sexy, because sexuality is a female resource in a straight society. To maximize its value, women essentially form a cartel to keep the price high. And a woman who comes across as too overtly sexy, she's viewed as a scab. She lowers the price of the resource for everyone else. So women use social slaming. They call each other sluts and trying too hard to punish these rule breakers and force them back into the cartel, right? They're not just jealous, they're protecting the market value of their own sexuality. So I remember when I read on the sex industry, like one stripper would castigate another stripper for showing too much and for spreading, and the solo porn star would castigate those porn stars who have sex with other people or with groups, right? We all have a need for some kind of moral hierarchy, for a moral system to explain the world, for a hero system, and some way of protecting our ego that makes us better than everyone else. So that's the uncomfortable topic here, the friction between biology and evolution, which is brutal, which is honest, and civilization, which is all about being polite and repressive. So biology says, she looks fertile, I want her. Civilization says, she looks professional, I respect her colleagueship. So women currently usually get to operate closer to the biological line in how they dress. Men are forced to stay strictly behind the civilizational line via silence. So in 2009, I interviewed the pundit and author S.E. Cupp. I asked her, how do you react when you feel that a man is looking at you with lust? She says, I'm disgusted. She says, women in Manhattan are objectified walking down the street every day. It's disgusting. It doesn't do anything good for me. It doesn't excite me. I know women who use it as a barometer for how good they're looking that day. Ooh, it gives me the creeps. I don't enjoy it at all. There's not a single ounce of enjoyment that I get from that. Do you think that's true? Do you think we should take her at face value?
Actually get confirmed to replace that person? Does he want to get someone confirmed by the Senate to replace that person? Or is he going to try to do these actings that we've seen through the Vacancy Reform Act that the courts have been shutting down? He's been trying this with Lindsay Halligan, Alina Habba, with U.S. attorneys. But the same thing applies to cabinet members, too. So I wonder whether they're not sort of letting some of this shake out, see what the courts actually will say on this before turkey dropping the cabinet.
Okay, but if you had to bet your savings on one of them going, who would it be?
Oh, it's Bondi. Yeah.
Okay.
Can we just stay on this for 1 second because it's so fun? What do you make? This is a little bit of a sidebar, but I think it's relevant only because I read this and thought Susie Wiles is going to be out by the end of the week, and I was totally wrong. Why did Susie Wiles, who by all accounts is a pretty incredible chief of staff, and then all of these other people, Carolyn Levitt, Stephen Miller, J.D. why did they participate in this extensive story with Vanity Fair?
Oh, I mean, I'm a former comms operative, right? So like this was sort of my bread and butter, is figuring out like what's in your interest, what's not, what risks do you take. There's something weird that is hard for people to sort of understand. When you're spending this much time with another human being, you bond with them whether you want to or not. But what's fascinating about some of the really good reporters out there is that they are able to fake that bond, but they're not bonding.
So my father taught me about how propinquity breeds very intense feelings. So he worked around a woman who was a bit overweight and who wore glasses and wasn't conventionally attractive, but working next to her day in and day out. And he started to develop romantic feelings for her.
Back. And it's like this weird human surprise, basically.
I think Sarah Isgur is like the best podcast host. I mean, she's hilarious. She is so good at this.
That like they're not bonding with you. So I'm surprised that Susie Wiles agreed to something that is the opposite of what got her to where she is, which is
total discretion. Yeah.
Yeah. My guess is that this was not her pick, that they decided.
We are all vulnerable to the implied pleasure of someone giving us rapt attention, right? We're all vulnerable, even Susie Wiles.
That this was sort of in everyone's best interest, someone else, whether it was Caroline Levitt or someone else within the comms world. But
don't you think it was Donald Trump himself, who still lives in a world before the internet mostly and loves linear television and prestige magazines?
I mean, he certainly does, but he also doesn't care when it's not about him. There's not like, I can't wait for them to have a profile of my chief of staff. So if it had been about him, yes. But No, I think, she's the first female chief of staff in the United States history. And I'm sure there was a sense from someone that, like, they need to treat us the way that they would treat this if it were the first female chief of staff, but during a Democratic administration. And yeah, I mean, my favorite moment is when J.D. Vance says he'll pay him $1,000 to make Marco look bad, and then tweets out a couple days later, I'll get that $1,000 in the mail. Thanks.
That was an extremely unflattering picture. Okay, we can talk about Vanity Fair all day. As you mentioned, Sarah, and as everyone knows, Republicans control everything, but maybe not for long in 2026 because we're going to have these critical midterm elections. In the Senate, more than 30 seats are going to be on the ballot, including special elections in Florida and Ohio, and Republicans are defending 22 of them. For Democrats to win back the majority, they need to gain a net of 4 seats. So, first of all, Dems, they going to retake the Senate?
The Senate is the harder one.
So there's this terrible, mediocre, just mess of a book that is receiving all this glowing elite coverage. It's called In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us. Right? Some couple of liberal political scientists write this terrible book. And when the conventional media praises this book, right, they're saying that they prefer therapeutic complexity over brutal truth. Right? The book is muddled by design. In academia and in much of elite life, clarity is dangerous. Honesty is dangerous because clarity assigns blame. So it wasn't that politics failed us during COVID, right? Certain people failed us, right? Politics is an abstraction. But academics love these sort of abstractions, right? If you just nod along to this book, you just lack seriousness, right? You're claiming a worldview where agency doesn't exist. It's the intellectual equivalent of a child saying, the lamp broke, instead of, I knocked the lamp over and I broke it. Right? To praise this framing is to embrace elite unaccountability. So you often find elites praising these muddled books because they prefer incomprehension for truth, right? They confuse incomprehensibility with sophistication. Right? The truths of COVID are often simple, quite stark. The United States did not protect its citizens as well as it could have. Right? Praising in COVID's wake is a tell, right? It reveals that you want to be soothed rather than informed, right? You love this complex, elaborate permission structure for the expert class to forgive themselves without ever admitting the bad things that they did, right? If you find this muddled mess of an account insightful, it's because you are looking for an excuse to move on, not because you want the truth about what happened, right? This book is not a true reckoning. It's a permission structure for the elite to forgive themselves, right? We have 2 eminent academics from Princeton. So they write about how liberal governance failed, but what they're really doing is engaging in a process of institutional inoculation. Yeah, we got it wrong, but we're still the smartest, the most moral people in the world. We are the most qualified to explain what went wrong and why we still deserve status and power, right? This is an effort at preserving their status, right? If an outsider wrote this book, they often present probably an indictment of the expert class, but we've got Princeton professors writing it, so it's a courageous act, guys, of self-reflection that ultimately reinforce their expert class's right to rule, right? Note the title, How Our Politics Failed Us, right? Classic deflection. It suggests the failure was a vague, systemic, nebulous cloud called politics or polarization. Right? Specific people made specific decisions to censor specific dissenters, right? The book reframes active suppression and censorship as premature moralization. It reframes tyranny as intolerance of reasonable dissent, sanitizes the brutality of the censorship of this era into, it's a procedural error. And the elites celebrate this book because of the willingness to question the orthodoxy today. Right? You only question it now because it's safe. You don't get credit for courage when you wait until the danger passes. Right? Recommending this book is a way for the chattering class to signal that they are sensible, they are open-minded, but they don't have to apologize for anything in their class did 5 years ago, right? This book is a plea bargain. The expert class is pleading guilty to the lesser charge of groupthink and censorship to avoid the capital charge of illegitimate authority. And thank God we had the excellent left-wing podcast, If Books Could Kill, who deconstructed this book. Oh, no. Do I have to sign in? Bloody hell. This is so complicated. All right, let me play Sarah Isgur.
I think, for Democrats to retake. Texas is where my eyes are focused on because it could be such an easy loss for Republicans if the current Attorney General, Ken Paxton, gets the nomination. It would be the first Democrat elected statewide in Texas in 30 plus years. But Ken Paxton is uniquely bad as a candidate. And so what will Donald Trump do to prevent Ken Paxton from getting that? On the flip side, Democrats now look posed to nominate Jamie Crowder.
I had to sign into bloody Apple Podcasts, mate.
I've been dealing with a very Hobbesian ailment lately. I believe that I have turf toe.
Your feet are transphobic?
It's
So Michael Hobbs is the womanly sounding gay co-host. This isn't me, right? He describes himself as sounding like a woman. So this isn't me engaging in homophobia. And Peter, the other co-host, is straight and married, but they're both on the left.
like a sprain of the big toe. They call it turf toe because it happens in sports with AstroTurf a lot.
How did you do that?
Probably just walking. Basically, it's like you overextended or like a little too harshly or whatever.
That is Hobbesian. It's like my humors are out of balance. There's no actual reason it's happening.
We've been going on a lot of like walks around our local like reservoir and stuff for a few miles, and
look at you.
It could have been from workout stuff. I don't know.
This is your 40s, dude. You're doing like CSI reconstructions, and you figure out that your pillow was like half a centimeter too low, and so your neck hurt for like 2 weeks.
So many of my friends my age are dying or they're out of breath walking a block. They're physically falling apart. I mean, I'm thriving. Nothing hurts. Everything works. I can do my pull-ups and push-ups and my weights. But I'm vulnerable, right? I'm mortal. One day things will stop working as they should.
If my neck is not like at like the angle that God chose when I'm watching television, it will hurt for 3 days.
Same. But it doesn't stop me from doing it anyway.
I've been lying on couches in various ways for 40 years.
Yeah.
And suddenly it doesn't work?
I know.
What
I'm
are
not
you
going to
talking
stop
about?
doing it just because it's literally killing me.
Absolutely not.
Okay, what have you zing-wise?
Okay, yeah, I can do it.
Peter.
Michael.
What do you know about In COVID's Wake?
All I know is that the only book about COVID that I want to read is the one about why it turned every Republican insane.
This book, this podcast is just hilarious, right? Two blokes on the left, but want to know how to do a captivating podcast, right? You can listen to this and learn, man. This is so good.
The full title of this book is In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us. It is by Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee, two political scientists at Princeton.
Not real jobs, folks. Unemployed as far as I'm concerned.
There's really no reason for us to be talking about this book. This book, just to spoil it, this book is awful. It's reactionary. It has a very self-published on Amazon kind of feel to it. It's just kind of janky throughout.
Yeah, you already said that they're political scientists, Michael. We can move on.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about this, but these...
So there's just something about being human that gives us great pleasure at putting down entire other groups. I know this elite, educated, left-wing young woman who's quite woke, but she would just refer to, vast swaths of the United States as just pure trash. Now, Australia is much stricter with regard to COVID than the United States, and as a result, also it being an island, it had 1/40th of the per capita death rate as the United States in 2020. After 2020, its per capita death rate pretty much matched the United States. Now, the US didn't lock down like Australia because it has a different structure. They're both federal systems, but Australia has a parliamentary system, and it has a culture of the greatest good for the greatest number. Australians put more emphasis on mateship and fairness. Americans tend to put more emphasis on freedom. So when COVID hit Australia, they formed a national cabinet where the politicians got together. They suspended normal politics. They coordinated border closures. They locked down cities, and they had the legal and the cultural machinery to do it. I think more Americans would have supported harsher lockdowns to save lives, but America delegates a lot more power to states and cities than Australia. So in America, power is fractured. It is distributed widely. The federal government has very limited power to lock down a population, right? That's a state police power. The U.S. system is designed to prevent any kind of rapid, unified action. So American elites talked a big game about safety, but they lacked the power to enforce it. So instead, U.S. elites censored more because they could govern less.
These authors have been featured on episodes of The Daily, on an entire segment on PBS NewsHour. They are being featured in all kinds of like mainstream respectable media. And the message of this book is providing like a backbone for this wave of COVID revisionism that has the costume of something that is like a serious reflection on the mistakes that we made during COVID, but it's actually just like right-wing agitprop.
I'm glad we're doing this just because I have noticed anecdotally the proliferation of arguments about COVID that are basically arguments that like we did too much.
Yes.
And implicitly that we should have just let it rip.
Yep.
Which to me, a man of science and reason, feels a little wild when we know that COVID killed 1 million people here and counting with these measures. It just feels a little bit crazy to me to be like, did we go overboard?
I think this is the main thing that really bugs me, like on a gut level about this book, is that like they are lying to your face about something that you remember.
Right.
2020 was not that long ago. I remember the fucking pandemic, right? I know the statistics. If you look at...
So the Australian states had the power to lock down. So during the first year and a half of COVID, you couldn't move between states in Australia. But in America, that kind of lockdown would be illegal. So Australian politicians had a lot more power. Right, they could fine people thousands of dollars. Right, violating COVID restrictions in Australia brought $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 fines. American politicians only had soft power. They couldn't close state borders. That's unconstitutional. They couldn't strictly enforce lockdowns. Right, they were unable to control people, so they became obsessed with controlling minds and narratives. Right, they ramped up the censorship on YouTube, social media, precisely because they had lost control of the virus in the real world. One thing the U.S. system was good at was throwing money at innovation. So U.S. elites delivered the vaccines faster than anyone else. The U.S. failed at the social task of social distancing, but succeeded at the technological task of making vaccines. Australia succeeded at the social task, but lagged on the vaccine rollout. So I am open to some tyranny in some circumstances. I am more of a Hobbesian than a Lockean. So from the perspective of Thomas Hobbes in his classic work, The Leviathan, the state of nature, right, the state of reality without government power is life is nasty, brutish, and short. From the John Locke perspective in the state of nature, right, things can be much more benign. We can make deals with each other. So the American, what's called the right in America, tends to be more classical liberal and much more Lockean, right? I am a Hobbesian. I believe that you need a Leviathan that can be ready to step in when you need it so that people survive. And I'm open to a certain amount of tyranny if it's effective, right? I'm kind of a devotee of Lee Kuan Yew, who was the ruthless technocratic governor, head of Singapore. So the Australian elites, they were ruthless and effective. American elites were nagging and ineffective. Right? It was easier to respect a government that locks you down and saves lives than a government that lets you die while banning your YouTube comments. So in a Republican Party and a Conservatism Incorporated filled with Lockeans, I'm very much a Hobbesian. So the United States was faced with a genuine biological threat to the nation. The American right did not respond with a plan for order or protection. Right? They responded with a reflex for libertarianism. Right? This was shallow. The right retreated to 1990s style slogans. Don't tread on me. My body, my choice. I don't wear a mask. Right? For me, primary duty of the state is to protect the lives of its citizens. And by arguing the government had no right to intervene, Conservatism Incorporated essentially argued that the state should be impotent in the face of death. I want a right that says this virus is a foreign invader. We will close the borders. We will mobilize industry. We will impose strict discipline to crush the threat, restore normality. Right? That was the Australian response, order. The American right gave you the Applebee's response, consumer liberty. So Conservatism Incorporated in the United States lacks a theory of governance, right? They've spent 40 years trying to dismantle the state, not to run it, and they just couldn't offer a competent alternative policy. So instead of saying the CDC is incompetent, here's a better plan to stop the virus, they said, the virus isn't so bad, the experts are lying.
official COVID death rates, so adjusted for population, America is the 17th worst in the world. So out of 190 countries, only 16 countries have more COVID deaths than we do. And if you look at excess deaths, which is like a more fair way to do country comparisons because a lot of countries didn't track their COVID deaths very well, we're 30th. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, people often try to kind of write this off as like, well, we're not New Zealand, right? We're not a small country.
So the culture wars burn at about 10 times the intensity in the United States. So as long as you had liberals and liberal elites saying wear a mask, then the right instinctively said mask is slavery, right? Not a serious policy position. It was just a juvenile instinct to do the opposite of what the teacher, Dr. Fauci, said, right? So state capacity was reduced by conservatives to a culture war skirmish, right? To me, biosecurity is a matter of national security, right? A serious right-wing government would view a pandemic the same way it views a war. It's a time for shared sacrifice, for hierarchy, and executive decision-making. But the American right instead treated the pandemic as a scam and a civil liberties issue. They showed they were not ready to govern in a high-stakes environment. They signaled that they preferred the chaos of the free market to the discipline of the state, right? I put a higher priority on competence and order at times over liberty and license, right? The mainstream right says, oh, the government's trying to control you. Resist, right? Shallow chaos. My position, the government should control this situation, but they need to do it effectively. Right? I'm a Hobbesian in a party of Lockeans. I want the Leviathan to wake up and protect the village. Instead, the village elders just argue about whether the dragon is real.
Country where we can control our borders. We never could have handled it that well. But Canada has half the death rate of America. It was a massive blunder the way that we managed the COVID pandemic. It just was.
Also, a lot of the places where our death rates were terrible are places where people live like a quarter mile apart.
Yeah, South Dakota.
There's just no defending it.
In the introduction, actually, I'll send this to you. This is one of the core arguments they make throughout. They do this whole thing, this kind of Barry Weiss song and dance where they're like, I'm a liberal, but, from within our coalition, we really have to ask tough questions about where our groupthink is leading us astray. So here is this.
A vital source of strength and resilience is liberalism's commitment to fair-minded criticism and self-criticism, the willingness to entertain doubts, listen to other points of view, and revise our own commitments. These should not have been set aside under COVID. Oh my God, dude. I can't.
Dude.
I already hate these guys so fucking much.
This is why I can't stop skeeting about this. This is why every fucking thing I've done on the internet for like 3 weeks, it's like, fuck these people.
To many on the left, the willingness to listen fair-mindedly to those on the right is a luxury we can no longer afford. Not while Donald Trump occupied the White House, and not so long as the Republican Party remains in thrall to election deniers, climate change skeptics, and people who deny structural racism. This is a mistake. The partisan mindset has lumped reasonable questions in with irresponsible claims because both are associated with the same source.
So the good thing about listening to different perspectives is that sometimes you got to recognize, oh, your political enemy, sometimes he's right, sometimes he's more clear, sometimes he's more accurate than your own partisans.
Opposing party. This is a prescription for failures of critical thinking. Under COVID, there were heavy consequences. Okay, so this is the same argument we saw when we were talking about the lab leak in our bonus episode, now made free to all listeners.
Because we're philanthropists.
Where basically the idea is we got too oppositional.
Yeah.
Anything coming out of the right was rejected offhand, even though some of it was correct. Mm-hmm. Although it's interesting that he's like, we weren't listening to them because they're election deniers. It's like, well, RFK doesn't even believe in fucking germ theory, dude.
Right. They're not thinking through the consequences of what they're saying, right? They're not saying, oh, they're actually not climate change deniers. You may think they are, but they actually aren't.
Right.
No, they're just accepting they are climate change deniers. They did try to overturn a free and fair election. They're just accepting all that, but they're like, oh, but you're being too...
So I think it was Wednesday. Every time I try to look at the news, I was just flooded with stories about a Tatiana Schlossberg. I'd never heard of Tatiana Schlossberg. Turns out that she was some kind of Kennedy, and she'd published an essay in the New Yorker denouncing her relative, RFK Jr., who runs the Health and Human Services Department. Right? Why were we bombarded with stories about Tatiana Schlossberg? Just imagine she wasn't a Kennedy. Imagine she was just Tatiana Smith, and she didn't say anything negative about RFK Jr. She would have received 1% as much news coverage at the time of her passing than what this Tatiana Schlossberg received, right? on the basis of merit, she received 100 times as much news coverage as she deserved. Right? Why is it so often I go over to ESPN to get the latest on sports, and I'm bombarded with coverage of the WNBA? Right? Why? Right? She was useful. Right? She promoted the agenda of our dominant elite. Right? If she'd said nice things about her cousin RFK Jr., right, then she wouldn't receive much news coverage. Right? She provided a voice from the grave, warning against her cousin's policies. Right? She linked her terminal diagnosis of leukemia to his cuts to vaccine and medical research. So her death got policy relevance for those with an agenda. So you had a Kennedy attacks a Kennedy. She was a brave truth teller. She broke the family code of silence to protect public health. Right? You get a compelling drama. So you have narrative inflation in the news, right? Media coverage of a topic vastly 100 times, 1,000 times exceeds its organic market demand because the topic serves some larger cultural or political purpose for the publishers, whether it's Tatiana Schlossberg or all the coverage of the WNBA. And let's be honest, there is female sport that is quite compelling to watch, but it's not the WNBA. Right? Why do we get force-fed content? Right? Because people who control the news have an agenda, right? It's not about box scores. It's not about jump shots with the WNBA. It's about gender equity. It's about representation. It's about supporting women, right? This isn't all about Tatiana Schlossberg, the real person. She is a symbol of the war against the Trump administration, right? You got these massive engines for online debate and culture war, and Tatiana Schlossberg just triggers the agenda of those who have power. And so you notice this enormous gap between merit, right? How important the story is, and the narrative utility to the people with power. And the utility was higher than the merit, and so you just become bombarded with propaganda.
Mean to them.
I guess there's like a theoretical argument here that's understandable, where it's like not every single thing that comes out of right-wing circles is necessarily wrong. Sure. The thing is that I don't think that is the source of the left's positions on COVID.
Right.
It's just not.
I mean, we're mostly going to skip it because it's so boring, Peter, and we've read it a million times. But at least like a third of this book is dedicated to like criticism of dissidents was unfair. People were too mean.
Yeah.
And then every single dissident is somebody who said like, oh, COVID will only kill like 10,000 people. It's basically the flu.
Yeah, idiots. That's the thing. It's like,
we're fucking wrong.
When these people were running their mouth in early COVID, like, Elon Musk being like, I think the numbers will stop here, right?
Yes.
Just talking out of his ass.
Yes.
And a bunch of people are like, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Those people were correct.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, sorry, what do you think that we as a society should do with people who lie constantly and are proven to be wrong?
Right.
You don't think we should marginalize those people? I'm sorry, what is your understanding of like what a society is? Like what is merit?
Yeah.
Like you're trying to explain this to like a child. Like if you're good, you should get rewards, and if you're bad, you should get punishments. Like this is a really fundamental aspect of human community.
So there's another book comes from a leftist that was released in 2024 that's got a lot of strong and accurate criticism of the right. This one's called The Longest Con by Joe Conason.
Jared Kushner gave an order to the what was called T-Magic, which was the Trump fundraising committee, that they were going to stay in business after the election. They were going to continue after the election and keep raising money. And on the promise that they would have what they called an election defense fund, or maybe that's not the exact name, but the idea was we're going to
integrity.
Yes, we're going to use this money to contest the election, and that wasn't what they used the money for at all. In fact, that fund actually never existed, even though the RNC and the Trump committee mailed out millions and millions.
Rudy's still waiting for his check.
Yes, right. So. Yeah, that's right. They didn't pay those people, but they collected $250 million, and that Trump still has control of. And they've spent a fair amount of it on his legal fees, not on contesting the election, but on his criminal cases and his legal defense. But that's one of the biggest grifts and cons of all time.
What was the thing that you learned in researching and writing this book that most surprised you? Like, you just had no idea. Anything? Or did you expect everything that you came across?
Well, I mean, I've been studying these people for quite a while now, George, so it's like they don't often surprise me. But what I will say was of great interest to me, and it's something that I talk about a lot at the end of the book, is that within the right now, and I hesitate to use the word conservative to describe any of these people, they're not conservative. You're conservative, fairly, still. But
yeah, I'm trying to conserve things. I don't want.
You are.
I don't want to.
It's right.
Blow everything up.
Like the
even things I don't like. I don't want to. Yeah, that's all right.
Right.
I mean, it's not perfect, but I don't want to.
But what struck me about the culture of the right now is that it's a culture of impunity. It's a culture in which there is no sanction for the kind of behavior that I'm describing, and it's why.
The kind of behavior, what? Lying,
cheating, stealing, ripping people off.
It's a way of advancement.
It is a way of advancement, and the reason this is why it has metastasized, because there was never a sanction against it. Dating back to Roy Cohn, no sanction. It was all tolerated and even encouraged, to the point where you now have someone like Steve Bannon, who is going to go on trial. He's now out of jail, but he's going to go. He's going to end.
So this was a conversation that took place in July of 2024, and Rick Polstein did the first important work on this matter, the long con. It was an essay on how scams and supplements and all sorts of bogus schemes essentially fuel much of right-wing media.
There was actually a Ponzi scheme that was promoted during The Apprentice called ACN.
Oh yes, so that was a multi-level marketing scam.
Okay.
So
Ponzi
yes,
scheme.
so I'm glad you mentioned that because in the wake of The Apprentice came many scams that Trump then initiated on his gullible fans. And one of them was ACN, which was a multi-level marketing scheme, marketing a video phone. And these phones could actually only call other phones of the same kind, but they got people to buy in to sell them, and you would have to put up money to do that. And Trump collected millions of dollars just from sponsoring this thing, while other people lost a lot of money. And that happened again. He did it again with a nutritional supplements scam. That was also a multi-level marketing scheme. He did it with Trump University, which people have heard of more. That was a fake real estate seminar where he was supposed to tell you the secrets of becoming as smart as he actually is not about selling real estate, and had to eventually cough up $25 million because there was a sanction.
What is remarkable?
Why? Because 2 attorneys general went after him in New York and California. So he did one of these cons after another, and there's quite a bit about that in the book.
Thank you for writing the book, and thank you, George Conway, for all you've done.
So there's this longtime Harvard history professor who just announced he's leaving Harvard, and he released a long essay in Compact magazine.
What is remarkable really about the West and Western history is the degree to which the earlier civilizations have been folded into Western civilizations. What's driving the modern world off the cliff rather rapidly is forgetting about its tradition and embracing innovation. I'm worried that Western civilization will be regarded as a right-wing project, which is absurd on the face of it because most of the liberal and left-wing ideas come out of the Western tradition. Western civilization has the resources to revive things, and sometimes it's been very, very close to being destruction. Culture is not self-perpetuating. We have to make sure that we cultivate our civilization and learn about it.
Hello and welcome.
Tradition. I take the view of Sam Huntington that modern Western civilization is a fourth-order civilization that comes after the Greeks, the Romans, Christendom, the medieval Christian empires, and modern Europe. I think there are four civilizations that are connected by this thread of tradition. What is remarkable really about the West in Western history is the degree to which the earlier civilizations have been folded into Western civilizations, the Western tradition, I prefer to call it. Because it's not assured that when a country is conquered by an empire, that its culture will be preserved. It's normally the case, in fact, that the conquering empire destroys the culture of whatever.
Right, this is Professor James Hankins, a historian, and here are some juicy excerpts from his Compact Magazine essay. So in 2021, he was told by a member of the admissions committee that admitting a white male into the program was not happening this year. And a brilliant undergraduate who tutored, who was the best student at Harvard, right? He won the prize for the graduating senior with the best overall academic record. He was rejected from all the graduate programs to which he applied. Nathan Kofnes, he received, I think, a perfect GRE score, and he couldn't get into any elite American graduate program, so he ended up going to Oxford. So graduate admissions committees, right, in the wake of George Floyd's death, essentially developed an unspoken protocol, no white men. And if you're going to admit a white person, it has to be female. And he says that we have not hired with tenure a historian in a Western field in a decade. And he remembers that the term problematic, right, which is now universal in the academy, was derided at one point at Harvard as a Princeton term. Right? Teaching was such a low priority. And you had Harvard professors here who gloried in that we don't allow our priorities to be dictated by the intellectual interests of 18-year-olds. Right? That kind of statement is greeted with rapturous applause. Right? Focus on your research. Don't worry about teaching. You can just unload these unpleasant tasks on junior faculty and temporary instructors. Right? You don't have to serve your students. So those faculty who didn't have tenure, right, kept at arm's length, right? You're advised once you get tenure at Harvard not to associate too closely with the faculty who are not tenured, because it's highly unlikely they will get tenure at Harvard, and it's going to be painful when they have to leave. So in the early 1990s, there was typically a 2-book standard for getting tenure. Right? Your first book would be a published version of your PhD dissertation. Then the second book was supposed to be a field-defining book, where everyone in your subfield had to read the book, and it would immediately go onto graduate reading lists, right? Books read by other doctoral candidates when preparing fields for examination. Right? That's what would get you tenure. But this standard had to be shelved in the late 1990s when the faculty were under increasing pressure to hire more women. So when they hired more women, we also had to become a more nurturing department. Right? Every junior hire was assigned a senior mentor, and we received credit in our annual reports to the dean for the number of junior faculty and others that we had mentored.
It conquers. So when the Greeks were conquered by the Romans, the Greeks were regarded by the Romans as so advanced scientifically, philosophically, and culturally that they understood that they wanted to have Greek culture as part of the Roman Empire. And the Greeks that they were thinking of, which really begins the tradition, was the Homer to the Hellenistic period.
So just to be clear, the 4 periods then, it's Greek, succeeded by Roman, succeeded by the Christian Empire, which, as you describe it, and finally modern Europe and America. Is that right?
Yes.
Modernity.
Yes. Which begins in the 12th century, according to me. So,
well, I really want to get into that, but I just want to do a bit of a chronology for our listeners so they can get their head around this scope. The Greek civilization, you consider that the first thing that can be called a part of the Western tradition. Why is that? What are the founding ideas in the Greek civilization that you think persist to this day?
First of all, language. And the Greek.
Okay, back to Andrew Gold, who glories in, I confronted Britain's biggest racist.
That other ethnicities could join this and also then become part of this greater ethnicity that builds something better.
No. They can't. We've built our people as who we are now. We don't want to become. We don't England to form into another. We don't the English to form into another ethnic group that's mixed in with some Bangladeshis and some Indians or some Africans or whatever it may be. Because then that's not the English.
Yeah, but that's what the Anglo-Saxons would have said when the Normans came over. We don't want them coming over in, and it actually went pretty well in the end.
Yeah, and this is over 1,000 years ago, and these times are very different to what they are now. Those were invaders. They were not welcomed in to actually replace your people and let them sit back and watch it happen and actually pay for the privilege of it as well.
Well, they assimilated and they mixed and then they created this amazing culture over. There were also back then from 1066.
So there was a video released on YouTube of about 40 minutes by a bloke named Nick Shirley about Somali childcare fraud in Minnesota.
Hello, we'd like to ask where the money's going. What do you guys think about the fraud that's taking place here in Minnesota?
I don't think anybody is enabling fraud to happen.
Hold Governor Walz accountable for this.
What was this money spent on? 1.26 million. What was that money spent on? There aren't any kids.
Answer the question. Are there children? There's no children inside this building.
Potentially the largest fraud scandal in U.S. history is taking place in Minnesota as literally billions of dollars have been funneled through Somali-ran fraudulent businesses. So much fraud, it could actually almost replace the entire GDP of Somalia. These fraudsters have worked hand in hand with the Minnesota government as they enabled billions of dollars to be given to fraudulent businesses underneath welfare purposes. Some of this money eventually landed in the hands of terrorist groups in Somalia like the Al-Shabaab, and others enriched themselves all at the U.S. taxpayers' expense. And in this video we will break down all...
Okay, we don't know that the money ended up in the hands of a terror organization. That's just an allegation for which very little evidence is being presented. So this video received millions and millions of views, but it's not providing substantial evidence. It's providing video of what seems to be a massive fraud.
All of the fraud from start to finish, from going to the fraudulent businesses and confronting the people who are making millions of dollars from the government. And we will also be confronting the incompetent government leaders who let this fraud happen. And to make this happen, I met up with a man who's been doing his own investigation for years now as he has seen the fraud firsthand. His name is David. Let's get into this and be prepared to be shocked. How deep is this fraud here inside of Minnesota?
It is far worse than anybody can imagine. You heard it's 7 to 10 billion and maybe more, and now the numbers have been revised and put out there publicly that they think it's more like 8 billion. How I got involved is that where my office is here in Minneapolis, I'm sort of in the heart of all of this fraud, and I would see these child care centers. I said, well, there aren't any kids there. It's the middle of the day and all that.
And I got a super chat. Thank you. $10 from the Mighty Puck. Happy New Year. Buy the dip. Keep the needy in your thoughts. Anyone know how Kevin Michael Grace is doing? And Mighty Puck talks about the popularity of this video, attributing it in part to Elon Musk and his retweeting. If you like nationalism combined with populism, you'll probably enjoy National Conservatism, and a podcast that just released a few hours ago.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stutman. I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, as always, and for this, the last podcast of 2025, we have a juicy array of topics to get to. Amber's going to kick us off by talking about Nick Shirley's viral video seen around the world exposing the continued probe and further corruption and fraudulence in Minnesota, and in particularly concentrated in the Somali population there. I'm going to talk a little bit about year one of Trump 2's successful immigration policies. Inez is going to talk about what I would call no university for white men, or this James Hankins article around Harvard's hatred of white males and really the decline of Harvard University. And last but not least, Will is going to take us home to talk a little bit about AmFest and the state of the right. But with that,
So American politics can be understood as the coalition of the fringe against the white European Christian core of the country. If you're in the white Christian European core of the country, then of course you're going to be up in arms with all these Somalis and all the fraud allegations. But this Somali fraud story, it has completely transcended tribal bias, right? It's moved from accusation to forensic reality. So culture war version of the story is right-wing YouTuber films empty building. Right, bipartisan reality story is left-wing attorney general and federal prosecutors indict dozens for a $9 billion theft. Right, this story is not just coming from Fox News; it's coming from non-profit news outlets like the Minnesota Reformer. So you can find MAGA outlets talking about fraud, and liberals can say, "Oh, this is just racism." But then you have all these nonpartisan journalists revealing it's not just a few, bad apples stealing money. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars worth of fraud. You've got the Minnesota Attorney General, Keith Ellison, right, one of the most left-wing attorney generals in the country, who is prosecuting this type of fraud. Even Governor Tim Walz's administration recognizes the reality of the fraud, and he doesn't like the tone of the criticism. But he's hired Optum, right, a massive corporate auditor to review claims. He's frozen payment to these childcare sectors. Right, you don't freeze an entire sector's funding just because of a culture war, right? You do it because you see that the books are cooked, right? This story has transcended tribal bias because the evidence is structural, not anecdotal, right? Tribal story is those Somalis are stealing money. Post-tribal story is Minnesota Department of Health and Human Services removed all oversight controls, allowing a kickback economy to flourish where parents and fake providers split billions in Medicaid dollars, depriving actual disabled kids of resources, right? This story is now impossible to ignore wherever you are on the political spectrum.
Let's kick it off with Amber.
Thanks, Ben. Yes, this was indeed the video heard around the world by Nick Shirley, and it followed previous allegations of massive fraud in the Minnesota welfare.
So I noticed a lot of comments on social media like, where's the New York Times? Where's the corporate media on this story? Well, this video didn't establish anything, right? It showed video. And it suggested some things, but it wasn't some kind of definitive reporting.
Programs specifically for feeding hungry children. There was an organization called Feeding Our Future that was run by Somalis that has seen 70 plus indictments, the vast majority of whom are Somali Americans who were using the state SNAP and WIC programs to take millions of dollars. They spent it on luxury goods, sent some back to Somalia, which ended up in the hands of terrorist groups. Nick Shirley did a follow-up piece of journalism where he focused on Somali-run daycares, which were receiving individually millions of dollars from the state. And some were not in current operation while receiving this money. Some are basically just empty buildings that don't have any children being dropped off for daycare services. He showed the owners of these supposed daycares refusing to answer questions, locking the doors when he showed up. Now, conveniently, after he reported on this, one of the most famous daycares, quote unquote daycares from the video, which was called Quality Learning Center. They forgot the N in learning on the sign, which doesn't bode well for their argument that they are indeed a functional learning center, suddenly was busing in tons of kids to try to prove to the mainstream media cameras there that they were in fact functioning. But there was a state auditor of some kind who claimed that this place had actually just closed last week, but now suddenly it's open again and accepting children after the viral video. But it's very obvious what's going on here. And the response from Minnesota lawmakers, most notably, of course, the governor, Tim Walz, have been accusing people of white supremacy for calling out that this fraud does seem to be concentrated in the Somali community. He has claimed to have known nothing about this, although several state whistleblowers say that this has been reported to the government for at least a decade, and that they did nothing about it because they were receiving donations, political donations and votes from the Somali community. There's also Similar fraud rings happening in other states, like Maine is a notable one where they've had whistleblowers come forward. And it's very pervasive. It's a lot of money. By Nick Shirley's estimate in his video, he found about $110 million of fraud just in those daycares that he investigated. But statewide, the estimates are as high as $9, $10, $11 billion that have been stolen.
Okay, so Nick Shirley doesn't have the ability to accurately estimate how much fraud, right? He's not establishing anything. He's really just suggesting anecdotally.
From Minnesota taxpayers. One other thing that the Daily Caller was the first to report on was that the one of the top-ranking Republicans in the House of Representatives, Tom Emmer, who is a representative from Minnesota, was begged by his constituents back in 2016 in a town hall meeting that was covered on the podcast This American Life to stop the Somalians from coming in. They said they weren't assimilating, they were stealing money, and they wanted a moratorium on all Somali immigration into Minnesota. And Tom Emmer accused his constituents of racism and said that there was nothing that he could do, that Somalis were the fastest assimilating community in the United States, that they were just like the Germans. So basically go pound sand. Now he's, of course, leading the charge and is one of the loudest voices calling for denaturalizing and deporting the Somalis. But it all just seems too little too late, right? They've already stolen all of this money. There's already been massive issues with rape in Minnesota and other areas where there's a concentration of the Somali population. The Trump administration has responded by promising to have the FBI investigate. The FBI has already led the DOJ to bring indictments against some of the individuals allegedly responsible for these fraud schemes. And it looks like, according to a statement from Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, that they are going to look at kicking these people out of the country as well. But with that primer, I'll kick it over to the group for thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is that the failures of Doge within Washington, D.C., right, to root out corruption to the level that Elon Musk wanted to do and ran into all the predictable barriers within the way that government and the culture of Washington, D.C. works. It almost seems like that mission has been democratized now. And because it's not just in Minnesota. So people took what Nick Shirley did. And here I want to point out that the first two outlets to start covering this, or the first two reported pieces, one was Chris Rufo writing with someone, and the other one was Country Highway, who claims to have the story first. So there's like a credit war going on between those folks. But regardless, that has shown a national spotlight on this. And the more light is on this, the bigger and more obvious it seems. And there seems to be, like I said, this democratization of looking into this type of fraud, whether it's in medical service centers, daycare centers. So I've seen people using AI to try to track where these payments are going in Massachusetts, in other metro areas, trying to see what's going on, forwarding it to the federal government. So we may yet see the mission of Doge succeed. In terms of the specifics of this, what I'm most interested in is what happens to the politicians and the Democrats involved in this. It seems impossible that this level of fraud would take place without, at minimum, them looking the other way. And indeed, it seems like there's a lot of evidence that they actively stopped investigations from happening. And as Amber suggested, there are allegations that was essentially quid pro quo for block voting from the Somali community. If that's true, that itself is criminal. And those officials, those democratic officials, should go to jail, as well as the perpetrators of this fraud. So that's what I'm looking for. Is in the Nick Shirley video, there's an interesting moment where there is a white Minnesotan lady who's just screaming, "Don't open the door! Don't open the door! It's ICE! It's ICE!" I mean, really, at the end of the day, like that's the problem. It's obvious that this community is importing all of the same cultural behaviors as they had back in Somalia. But the real problem is that we have elected officials, an entire party, and maybe half of the other party that was just willing to tolerate that for the sake of a kind of lie about, not wanting to be racially offensive or screaming racism at the fact of the matter and these cultural facts. So that's who I'd like to see held responsible ultimately.
On the politicians aspect of this, as we covered previously, there were ties between Ilhan Omar, there were ties between Keith Ellison, there were ties between Mayor Fry and those who were indicted and prosecuted in the Feeding Our Future case. And of course, there's been analysis out there, including my own analysis when it comes to Omar, on the campaign contributions received from the fraudsters. But the much deeper questions, and the ones that when these cases started to be investigated and prosecuted, which dates back to the Biden administration, that we don't know are how deep was the nexus between the politicians beyond what we can glean from publicly available materials? Is there evidence that's currently held by federal authorities that links the elected officials and their offices to the frauds? What did the politicians know? When did they know it? To what extent did they profit from it, directly or indirectly? And then this also brings us back to a much broader theme, and this is something that matters nationwide, but we're seeing a particular spotlight shown on it in Minnesota, which is the welfare state combined with open borders, and in particular refugee resettlement, which, by the way, the refugee resettlement programs themselves have often been defrauded, and there's a financial incentive to increase refugee resettlement efforts among the NGOs that are involved with it, arguably. But basically, you had a Democrat Party there that imported en masse a population and then enabled that population to take advantage of a welfare state, and then received political support from it in the way of votes, and then, of course, in the way of contributions as well. Then you also have, by the way, the complicity of the local media in the Twin Cities area in particular. Now, it's worth noting and crediting some others as well, because there have been some who have been on the case of Somali fraudsters and fraud in these programs dating back years. A few worth noting: Scott Johnson and the folks at Powerline more broadly, who've covered this extensively, folks at the Center for American Experiment, Alpha News as well, a local source. But the fact that Chris Rufo, Nick Shirley, and others have shined a light on this have exposed, I think, these much broader stories, which are national in terms of scope, which is, again, welfare state and then exploitation of the welfare state and who benefits from it. And so a doging of every single state's systems is absolutely necessary here. And I think that is really what matters at the end of the day. It's not about what happens or what's going to happen in Minnesota. The size, scope, and extent of the fraud is breathtaking when we're talking about potentially up to $9 billion, according to the U.S. attorney there. But it's these much broader themes about the welfare state itself, who exploits it, and then last but not least, who comes to the country matters. It's not just untrammeled immigration being a problem. It's not just illegal immigration, but legal immigration as well from folks that are from third world basket case countries that consist of people who have inimical views and oftentimes hostile views. And I think what we see here is the total contempt for America in the brazenness of having places like Luring Center instead of Learning Center. They're shoving it in our faces, and essentially you have the Democrats, and maybe some Republicans too, effectively paying tribute to this population here in Minnesota, and that's sickening.
Yeah, I mean, my father-in-law no longer does this, but for at least a decade, he ran a couple of childcare centers. And even now I can walk across the hall and see an enormous pile of paperwork that was involved in running those facilities. And I know the regulatory burden on childcare operators is immense. Like if you're actually trying to run a normal childcare that takes in kids and gives them care, it's just a very, very difficult, time-consuming undertaking. You're constantly worried about getting teachers in the door who are taking care of the kids well, making sure you're not below teacher staffing ratios, even when a number of teachers call in sick, which is a common thing because, it's a competitive market. You have to keep your prices low. Wages for daycare workers are not super high. So it's a very, very challenging business to run. It consumed their lives for a decade, my father-in-law, my in-laws. And so to see the Somalis not even really trying, I mean, you as someone who actually brings kids to daycare, that child Leering Center is obviously not a daycare. It's obviously non-functional because it's like a building in the middle of an ugly strip mall in the middle of the city. There's no outdoor play area. There's no it doesn't look like the kind of place you would ever send your child. And apparently nobody ever sent their children there. And this is common in a variety of places. It's just a vehicle for fraud. And I saw one thing that really bothered me. Like, Batya had a whole take on the fact that, all this money that is being defrauded from us is one of the reasons that everything is so unaffordable. Like, we're just paying the price of the fraud that's sucking value out of the economy and giving it to Al-Shabaab or something. And Connor Friedersdorf, some like classical liberal weirdo, was like, how dare you, Batya? You're blaming the whole community for this. And part of me wants to say, most of the community is genuinely responsible for all this fraud. They're all in on it. They're all offering their kids up for kickbacks, huge numbers of them. And if, at a certain point, you sort of notice, like, hey, it's the bulk of the community here. I'm sure there are individual Somalis who aren't participating and are very hardworking, blah, blah, blah. But it's a huge chunk of the community that is straight up just doesn't view our system as, basically sees the United States federal government issuing these funds as something that they can just internalize and take for their clan and their tribe, and doesn't see any moral compunction or any moral issue about taking the money away. So I'm really... this needs to be a major issue for a long time. I just don't think the Democrats can win in a world where everybody is thinking about how these Somalis are defrauding people.
Well, now I'll turn to a related story, which is the contrast of year one of Trump 2 with what came before it in the open borders under the Biden administration. And of course, there's a tie here to what's transpired in Minnesota and elsewhere. And I think if we're talking about sort of singular achievements of the first year of the second Trump presidency, it has to be immigration. And I just want to tick through some of the metrics here that show you the way in which the administration has secured the border, restored territorial integrity, and then got into work to historic levels on also resecuring the interior of the country. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about what happens in the years to come. But the first sort of headline number is that there are 2.5 million fewer illegal immigrants in the country today than when Trump returned to office on day one. So 622,000 deportations, which is nearly 3 times the highest amount of deportations recorded, which came back in 2008 to 2009. And those numbers were sort of padded, it seems like, for political reasons as well. But that's neither here nor there. 3 times as many, the more than 200,000 that were deported in 2008 to 2009. 1.9 million self-deportations, which is probably the real testament to the administration's efforts. It shows you the deterrent value of aggressive and vigorous border enforcement. Beyond that, border crossings are down 93% for 2020, fiscal year 2026. So this is just including October and November numbers of this year. There have been the fewest encounters to the start of a fiscal year in modern history. It's amazing that this number has to be touted, but it obviously does relative to historic levels. But there have been 0 releases of illegal aliens apprehended for 7 straight months, according to an early December CBP release. There have been 73,329 total apprehensions along the southwest border, 53% less than the monthly average during the Biden administration. Of course, there's been temporary legal status, which has been stripped of hundreds of thousands of people who are oftentimes not vetted and probably should never have been let into the country. Beyond that, there's been a comprehensive effort to break down silos of data held by different federal agencies, which is a massive, massive in the weeds issue, because you have all these different information resources within the federal government, and they've been totally siloed, and you can't cross-reference these different databases to identify the population of illegal aliens and then go about pursuing them for deportation. So those have been, of course, challenged in the courts, as have many of the Trump administration's policies. But the 2.5 million headline number is already chipping away at a quarter of what transpired during Joe Biden, which in some ways shows you how daunting the task is when you're talking about how massive the invasion was, but nevertheless remarkable in terms of scope and scale. And then if you're looking at what's coming ahead in 2026, the AP recently reported that the administration plans to hire thousands of additional agents, open new detention centers. There's billions of dollars in incremental funding coming to border security and law enforcement efforts related to immigration. And there's going to be an effort as well, again, to dramatically increase workplace enforcement, which I've always argued is sort of the key to the whole ballgame. If you really want to ensure that the illegal alien population is dramatically reduced, you have to target the employers. And it may well be that a handful of significant raids or prosecutorial efforts could have an outsized effect ultimately. So with all that said, again, I think this is probably the primary policy core to the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as the administration dubbed it in its new national security strategy. This is what the president was elected on twice. And I think despite all of the challenges, despite in particular the legal resistance and, of course, the propaganda of regime media countering these efforts, I think this is a real singular achievement, securing the border, stopping the flow of illegal immigration, and then reversing the effects of the invasion. So I'd put it out to the group, what do you make of year one efforts and what are you looking for over the next 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very impressed with this as well. And I've seen some of the blackpilling on the right, and I think it's actually very unjustified. You don't reverse 30 years of essentially putting up a sign and say, on our border that says, come here if you like and do what you like. That was the unofficial policy of the United States for 3 decades. I think it's unrealistic to expect that all of those millions of people would be gone overnight, with the snap of a finger. I'm actually very impressed. The administration is obviously prioritizing this across different departments. Here I'm thinking about the State Department scrutinizing visas, including student visas, much more than it used to. The Department of Ed is in this, right? And that's in addition, of course, to the Border Patrol and law enforcement. And there's clearly a multi-agency systemic effort across the federal government to use every avenue possible. I saw there was when the tensions are rising still with Venezuela, I saw Stephen Miller tweet about then maybe we can use this to get them deported. Or, it's obviously part of this broader focus and strategy. And I think it's working. And I think it would be a mistake to conclude that because the massive, massive problem hasn't been solved yet overnight in 1 year, that they are, not working as hard as they can. And I've been impressed, too, with the intelligence of the efforts. I think the one piece that I agree with the critiques on of the Trump administration is on the employer side. That is obviously the most politically difficult piece of it for them to do, because they have businesses coming in saying, how am I going to operate my business? How am I going to, operate my farm? This is going to cause prices to rise in the grocery store. And of course, the president is very concerned about that as a potential political weapon, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not necessarily excusing them. I'm just saying that's the piece that I would keep an eye on and keep the pedal to the metal in terms of calling out the administration. There has not been significant employer side enforcement. And to my mind, that is the final piece of this puzzle that would make it the best it could possibly be on the immigration question within the confines of how the law is. That being said, I want to point out there are a lot of jobs open in this field. The administration has staffing problems. Part of the problem of coming in and trying to dismantle the DC beast is that basically all the people who were working in these agencies very, very much oppose your ends. And the Trump administration has, and I've talked about it at length, the cases that they're launching essentially to be able to remove the officers that are in the federal government who are not doing the bidding of the president. That being said, when you get somebody out, you actually need somebody to do the work. So there are enormous opportunities. If you, for my next segment, if you're a white man being discriminated against at Harvard, you might want to consider whether your skills might be applicable in one of these agencies, because they are hiring and they need people to do this work. A lot of this, as Ben pointed to, is just requires bodies and intelligent and competent people to carry out the law.
Yeah, I totally agree on the employer side enforcement, especially since Trump, he's done some things to make it harder for H-1B applicants. He's increased the amount that employers have to pay to $100,000, but then publicly he's also said that he's very much in favor of expanding the H-1B program. So it's kind of mixed messaging there. But I wanted to highlight the self-deportation incentives that the administration has been giving. $1,000 plus a free flight home for most of the year, and then they upped that to $3,000 during December. And it's working, right? 1.9 million self-deportations through the end of the year, which is significantly more than the amount of people who were actually deported by the administration. And it's cheaper to do it that way, right? The $1,000 plus the flight is certainly cheaper than how much it costs to have ICE agents in the field tracking down illegal immigrants, having to go through the judicial process. So you're not only saving taxpayer money, but you're also getting people out of the country in a more efficient manner. And that's been a wildly successful part of this second Trump admin's immigration policy.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump administration has actually done a lot of things really well, I think.
And the chat asks, Luke, what percentage of your audience is pro-Semitic versus anti-Semitic? I think it's pretty much 50-50, but pretty close to 100% of the audience wants to have a more wide-open Overton window, more wide-open discussions, and more clear, open talk about how different groups affect each other and how all sorts of conversation about vital issues gets pathologized and called all sorts of dirty names. So one thing that brings my audience together is a desire for open conversation about uncomfortable topics.
I think we sort of take for granted that illegal crossings have basically stopped. There was a stat that just got put out on X. They looked at the month-by-month border encounters, and it went from 300,000 at the peak of the Biden wave in 2023 to less than 10,000, it looks like. Less than 10,000 encounters a month, so a few hundred a day. The Border Patrol is able to basically stop people from being admitted to the country. Illegal crossings have basically stopped. That's one of the most impressive policy accomplishments I can remember. It's a direct promise he made to the people to get the border under control, and he's delivered. A lot of people are complaining about deportations and the rate not being fast enough. I have two big points there. First off, the comparison to Obama is a frivolous one. Remember, Obama was trying to juke the stats and make it look like he was doing much more deporting than he actually was. So he was counting turnaways at the border as deportations. That's not realistic. And as Trump can't do that because he's effectively stopped anybody from even trying. So he's not getting those cheap stats. And second, when people are here, they have these legal protections that exist under the statute, as we saw in the Abrego Garcia case, and we see in every one of these deportation cases, that allow judges to get involved. It's really, really challenging, really hard to get people deported. They're doing what they can, but it requires going through the process and building the machine of legal process in terms of prosecutors and immigration judges, et cetera, to churn through these people and get them removed if they've been in the country for a while. So the Trump administration is doing a lot. It's doing a great job. And I think we should, people shouldn't be so black-pilled.
With that, let's go to Inez on Harvard.
Yeah, I think another aspect where people should not be as black-pilled. I really have been impressed with this administration, and I want to bracket this by saying I criticize heavily the first Trump administration for not doing some of these things, both in immigration and especially because it's my field in the higher ed context.
For your average supporter of Trump or of MAGA, right, you have to be overjoyed by 2025. I think by any normal accounting, Trump vastly exceeded the expectations of his base.
So it's not that I am afraid to criticize them. I genuinely think they are doing a stellar job. And one of the places in which they are doing a stellar job is higher education. That being said, obviously, our higher education institutions, our universities are nests of vipers. And we knew that already. But Compact, following up on the last pod we did where I highlighted this potential sort of permission structure piece from Compact magazine about anti-white discrimination in a number of fields. They're following that up with a piece specifically from a Harvard professor who is resigning his position at Harvard primarily because of the discrimination against white males, but also in ideologically adjacent critique of the fact that they don't want to teach anything great about Western civilization. And in fact, he highlights Harvard turned down an enormous grant from a private foundation to do a Western civilization course because they simply did not want to focus on the greatness of Western civilization. Even when somebody was willing to donate millions and millions of dollars for them to do so, they weren't willing to do it. But those two things seem to have factored in to his decision to leave, to go to the University of Florida. They have the Hamilton Center there. And I wanted to highlight this not only because of the discrimination in admissions, and he points to specific instances where he had white male students who were incredibly promising and who were, he said, should have been at the top of any applicant pile, who had the best grades, who had the best test scores, who had the best, body of work when they were applying to graduate school, were turned down, and very explicitly because of their race and their sex. And he actually apparently was one of these students. He called around all the other graduate programs he had been turned down from, and all of them were doing the same thing. This was during, in some ways, the peak of the woke hysteria and the racial hysteria in 2020 and 2021. He also points to the way that the college has dealt with COVID as a reason for him leaving. But overall, I wanted to point to the story not only because of the obvious discrimination that we knew was happening in elite universities and how much worse it actually got and more explicit and more aggressive in 2020. It had been happening for decades, but it got very blatant in 2020 and 2021. Sorry, I lost my train of thought with my kid yelling at me, but not only was that discrimination going on for decades, it got much, much worse in 2020, much more explicit in both admissions and in hiring and in graduate programs, essentially cut off the pipeline for millennial and Gen Z white male talent. And we know that continued into the private sector. And that's what the previous compact permission structure article was about. So following up on last week, I do think that there's been a corner turned in the discourse on this subject. I think that is to the good, even if people can criticize, aspects of how this happens. It's always annoying when you're saying something at the top of your lungs for a decade, and then finally, the equivalent of the New York Times, although Compact is very good. I don't want to criticize Compact but like the equivalent of, sort of the place where the libs will take it from. They publish the thing that you've known for 10 years and have been saying for 10 years. And then all of a sudden it breaks through into the discourse. So that's always annoying, but it is to the good that it happens, especially on this issue. In terms of the universities themselves, the final point I'll put on this is I see this as a very hopeful piece. Here we have a talented professor who is willing to be honest and to resign over this discrimination, who is going to what is essentially a new institution. It's been, stripped down to its core and now is being rebuilt, the University of Florida. And that's a project that needs to happen simultaneously with holding the old institutions like Harvard to the letter of the law. We have to build new institutions, because the best we can hope for in Harvard is that they will go a little bit underground with some of this ideological discrimination. We're not going to change their minds. That would be that'd be a quixotic goal of ours. Our goal should be to curb them in line with the law that they need to follow, or destroy them if they refuse to come to heel under the law. But that being said, that's the best case scenario there, is that you kind of dial back slightly on the ideological degradation that's present in some of these institutions. So that means we need new institutions, and Hillsdale, but there's new ones out there as well. The University of Florida is one of them, and it's encouraging to see talent migrating there as the result of this kind of ideological breaking point. I didn't ask a question, everybody. Sorry.
I was ready to go. You got to wonder, at what point are these, sort of white male wannabe academics going to realize that they just can't even go into the field? I mean, I remember thinking in law school, maybe trying to aim for the law professor track would be more up my alley, because I had a sense that sort of practicing big law wouldn't be for me, just in terms of the hours and the grind. And I was never better at working harder than other people. Like I could be more clever than other people, but I was not, I'm ADD. I wasn't going to win a competition where it was going to depend on my ability to be really industrious. And so I was like, maybe I'll go the law professor track. But the idea of getting in the law professor track as a white male conservative is just absurd. It's absurd. Every law school is dominated by left liberals, and who, if they aren't going to exclude you on the basis of your politics, are certainly going to exclude you on the basis of your race and sex. So it's just silly. And I mean, that's the phenomenon at every academic department now, is this thing made clear. And it's not just academic departments, it's private film studios, it's anything where liberals are dominant. If you're a white male, even if there are white males currently in power, they're just going to use the fact that they're there to not include you because there needs to be diversity. And obviously they can't give up their jobs. So, it has to be a generational war against millennials. I think this is, if you've seen obviously the young males are moving so far to the right, it's ridiculous. They're part of the Republican Party now, basically. I don't see a reason why they'd start voting for Democrats and voting for their own professional suicide. So, and this is just yet another example of it, I think. But I think you guys have talked about this before, that this is a permission piece. It's allowing, even more moderate people to talk about the fact that there's just this widespread discrimination against white people, which Jeremy Carl, friend of the podcast, has been on about and wrote an entire book about. But yeah, I don't know if you're a straight white male, why on earth would you be a liberal? They're trying to, you're on the menu for their party, and I don't know why you'd submit to being eaten.
I'll throw in a little black pill into the chat because, as great as it is to see these pieces come out and people being more willing to talk about anti-white racism and discrimination, the Democrats are still trying to do this, even the so-called moderate Democrats. Abigail Spanberger, who was just elected to be the new governor of Virginia, where I live, has announced her choice for Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the state. And it's a total nut job. This woman's name is Dr. Sesha Joy Moon. She says that DEI is nonpartisan and has a constitutional mandate, but then in other comments has suggested dismantling the Constitution. She's a big fan of Jasmine Crockett and Stacey Abrams. So as much as the culture has shifted and the conversation has shifted, and Democrats say that they're doing this whole soul searching project post 2024, they're still very much trying to appease their progressive activist base. And so we definitely cannot get complacent and think that we've shored up a victory because the Trump EEOC is tackling anti-white discrimination. It is still going to be pushed very heavily, even by the most supposedly moderate Democrats. And if they take back power federally in any way, we can expect that they are going to try to re-implement a lot of these regimes.
So on the story itself, which obviously naturally follows from that Jacob Savage piece, which was talking about some other sectors of the economy and the anti-white and anti-male discrimination and anti-white male discrimination there, it's extremely telling that we're talking about these pieces in late 2025, years after the worst excesses of this discrimination and bigotry were readily apparent to everyone who was witnessing them. And obviously that shows you the power and the fear that was instilled in individuals across these institutions based upon the sort of anti-cultural revolution that took place, really starting with and emanating from George Floyd and Minnesota. So we go back to Minnesota, I guess, here. But beyond that point that we're talking about, kind of years after this was all readily available for everyone to see, just to follow up on Amber's point, you have entrenched interest groups here that are so reliant on this ideology and dependent upon it for their livelihood that even setting aside the fact that there have been generations of people brainwashed into a worldview which says that discrimination is good, righteous, and just. You have programs. Just take, for example, race-based contracting with governments. If you look at the U.S. federal government, I'm going to be writing a little bit about this for Real Clear Investigations in the near future. There are programs that are explicitly based on gearing contracts towards, quote unquote, socially and economically disadvantaged people. And in practice, these programs prior to the Trump administration anyway, were essentially affirmative action handouts where you had basically preferential contracts, often no bid or limited bid contracts given out to companies that claim that they were minority owned. And there's a whole level of fraud, by the way, that the Trump administration is investigating here as well. But we're talking about tens of billions of dollars annually in federal contracts given out effectively on the basis of race. Then when you go down to the state and local levels, that number multiplies because you have race-based contracting for state and local governments as well. This is just government contracting with firms. This is setting aside, of course, the private sector implementation of a DEI regime itself. And so when you think about all of the people who are invested in this, to the point where there are even consultancies that are used by these firms to claim discriminated against status, etc. On top of the academics, etc., you're talking about just massive entrenched bureaucracies here that all profit directly or indirectly from propagating and perpetuating this worldview. So the Trump administration is doing yeoman's work here, following on the executive orders that the administration put forth very early on. But you're going to need codification in law. You're going to need vigorous enforcement of the law, and not just at the federal level, but at the state level as well. We haven't really seen, I can't point to, maybe some of you can, Congress actually codifying the anti-DEI efforts in law. Then, of course, you're going to have all of these institutions that, to Inez's point, engage in sub rosa efforts to de facto do what they did before in terms of discrimination. So
actual Republican voters, then there is the fighting among the influencers is not reflective of actual fighting among the Republican voters who are broadly happy with Trump. The influencers are dealing with trying to make sure that there are people watching on their podcasts. So there's going to be a big chunk of them drawn to conspiracy nonsense, and then a big chunk of them really infuriated by that. And rightly so, actually. I think a lot of people, everybody has a right to be extremely angry with Candace, what she's doing is just awful. But it's end up leading to a lot of bickering back and forth between influencers that I don't think is actually that productive. That said, I'm worried about it because if over the next year everybody's so divided and is still obsessing over Israel, which as far as I can tell is as an issue it should be really far down on the list of people's concerns right now. The war is over. If anything, Israel has just announced that it's doing a huge investment in its own military production capacity, which is going to obviate the need for American aid in probably 10 years. So I don't know what people are so upset about and obsessing about, and yet it seems to be dominating our conversation, probably because there's a certain subset of influencers, Dave Smith et al., who are in the position of having argued that the invasion of Iran, or rather not the invasion, but the military action against Iran would lead to World War III, and then it didn't. If anything, it looks like that one specific action by Trump resolved the war in Israel's favor, and then also Iran now is in such terrible shape that it might have its own kind of independent revolution. So there's no real problem with Israel yet. It seems like the discourse focuses on that, plus you have Candace focus on Charlie Kirk. I think hopefully I hope, and I guess the white pill way to look at it is that the reason that so much online discourse is focused on this stuff is because normal people aren't worried about politics right now. It's an off year. So the people who are particularly politics obsessed are the most likely to be conspiracy obsessed. And I think things will get better in the run up to the midterms. I'm still worried though. Obviously, it would not be good for Republicans to lose in midterms, and that's the most likely outcome. Part of the team, they're in a divisive project, while also saying Tucker Carlson's project of creating a friend-enemy distinction around your support or antagonism toward Israel is also extremely divisive and bad for the Trump coalition. There needs to be sort of a reasonable centrism.
Who are, let's say, more legitimately skeptical of the U.S. role in the world, skeptical of all alliances that the U.S. has had, including the U.S.-Israel alliance, very, very worried about finding ourselves entangled in foreign affairs in a way that, worsens or at least distracts from domestic affairs that are so serious. All of those are legitimate concerns. The president essentially gave those people the result, as Will hinted, that they wanted, right? There is no more war now in Gaza. We were...
Okay, let's leave it there. I'll talk to you later, mate. Bye-bye.